We are not-for-profit, although you read all sorts of neat stuff around mission and vision on our website. I like to summarize it as saying we're here because we really want to make government and what government does better, more relevant, and important in the 21st century in order to serve the needs of Canadians. So the kind of work you're doing is tremendously important. In my day, as probably the oldest guy in the room by about 20 years, policy was something that we could develop in-house, and government did. It owned much of the expertise. But here you are exploring some of the policy issues around the Internet of Things, and maybe going to be able to pull together data and information and your intelligence to help government make the kind of right decisions it should be making. So I applaud you. I think it's great you're here. I hope you like our space. We are really quite proud of it, and this is exactly the kind of purpose that it's used, to bring together people who will talk about the issues of the day and then maybe again help governments and others make the right policy decisions. So thank you for coming. Have a great session, and I hand it over to Mark, who you know.
Thank you, Toby. Welcome everyone to the second multi-stakeholder meeting in the Securing IoT process for Canada. Before I say too much, I'm going to do the quick housekeeping things. There's a washroom right there, but there's also one up a level, so if you're looking for washrooms there. I notice Wi-Fi credentials on the wall, so please log on and tweet this as much as you want to. Our hashtag is what?
Secure IoT.
Hashtag Secure IoT. I should have known that. I'd like to acknowledge our partners in this year-long process, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. There's a couple of people from CIRA here today. CIPIC, I think Tamir is here. Yes, he is. Hey, Tamir. Canary, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, and the Canadian chapter of the Internet Society. In fact, it was Franca who pulled this together for us today. So thank you. In a minute, Andrew Sullivan will put us all to work for the next few hours, but I'd like for all of you to remember that that work doesn't finish when we wrap up today at the reception at Open Door. We engage in a lot of intersessional work between multi-stakeholder meetings. We've held a few webinars with different folks to get their input. We have some background research documents that we're putting together from examining policies from around the world on securing IoT and their potential to be used in Canada. We have a project going on right now with a youth group out of Toronto to better understand how to communicate IoT security to young people. But we also have a series of listservs on the topics that we're going to talk about today. And I encourage you to get involved and certainly subscribe to the listservs and make your voice heard there. With that, I think I'll just introduce Andrew Sullivan from Oracle Dyn, and we can kick the day off. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Is this working? Yeah, you can hear me? Good. So I'm Andrew Sullivan, and I'm here because I've been doing various internet things for a while. I used to be the chair of the Internet Architecture Board. I've been involved in the Internet Engineering Task Force for a long time, and I do a lot of this sort of multi-stakeholder stuff, and I'm here to whip you into posting things onto the mailing list. So that's really what this is about. But what we're going to try to do today is to go over some of the things that we did at the last meeting, and try to focus on a couple of them and try to make some progress on it. Right, so the basic idea in any of this sort of thing, I mean, I'm a geek for a living, right? That's what I do. And the basic idea that we always have in building things on the internet is we're gonna take something and we're going to try to make some progress on that. And if we make some progress on that, that's a good thing. And if we don't make any progress on that, then what we do is we give up and we try something else. And you'd be surprised how well this works. I mean, to a large extent, actually, that's what's happened on the internet, right? Which is why most of the software that you use on the internet, you have noticed, right? It's all unfinished. That's because that's what happens. We get the part that we need, and that one's working, and then people move on to something else that seems like an urgent problem. Now, all of the things on this list from before are urgent problems, but I think some of them are more urgent than others. And therefore, what I'm going to try to do is get us focusing on some of those things from last time. So we're going to work for a little while. Who's keeping time for me? Because otherwise I'll just talk forever. Nobody. Okay, good. Excellent. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over these a little bit. We're going to have a break around 2:30. Assuming that, you know, somebody says, hey, shut up, at 2:30. And then we'll resume, I guess, at 3. And we're going to try to establish a couple of working groups to work on specific things here. Now, we've got a proposal to work on a couple of these, but we'll begin here at the beginning talking about these things and sort of decide whether we've got them in the right order, whether they're the right priorities, and so on. And if we've decided that we've got the right priorities, then we can immediately start to work on the specific issues. All right, with that said, we've got 10 items here, 10 items from the last thing. And you all have a copy of this. I think they're in your in the folders if you don't have them. So we've got this question about creation, use existing privacy and security certification labels for devices. So this is one thing that we were saying, oh, well, we can give devices little labels, and then people can, you know, people who are buying them will be able to make decisions about whether they're a good device for their uses. Then there's the second part that goes with that, right? And the second part that goes with that is, oh, okay, you've got all these devices, all these labels on them, but you don't know what to do about them. So for instance, right, it's not that useful to me to have a little label on a thing if I don't know what it tells me, if I don't understand what the label portends. Right, because there are lots of labels on my devices. I mean, you know, there are those CSA numbers. You know, you look at the thing and it's got like various sub things that tell you what the particular standard is that it implements. I don't know about all of you, but I don't know every bit of the electrical code. And so I don't always know what those things mean. And what we want, of course, is for these labels to be useful to people somehow. So how do we do those kind of awareness campaigns? And that's a second thing. There is this idea of which standards body could oversee the Internet of Things, or if none exists, we could create one. I would like to suggest very, very strongly that there's already plenty of people working on standards in this area, and if we decide we need to create a new standards body, we have lost our collective mind. So that's a line that I would like to draw in the sand, but you know, feel free to walk over it. At the same time, you know, I think we can have some discussion about that. There is this idea to identify threats and how to use various tools to mitigate those things. You can get the trolls out there and you know, cause some action in the world, which then, you know, causes people to respond to these threats. There's this question about how we're going to use this process to determine the best practices. And I think the particular idea here is that, right, this has got a Canadian focus. So we're not trying to solve the problem of the Internet of Things everywhere in the universe, because there are different problems in, say, Antarctica and here. You know, because there are fewer people in Antarctica, not because they're very cold, because we've got the cold climate. But we've got this question about, you know, what are the conditions under which these things have to work, and I think that that's an important question. We have to determine what the outputs of this process will be. And my suggestion, but again, it's just a suggestion, I'm not the boss of you. My suggestion is that this determinant of the outputs is actually an iterative process. That is, we discover what the outputs will be, and the way we discover those things is we do some work. We deliver an output. That's the way you discover those things. Then there's a bunch of stuff here about testing and evaluating the devices, and in particular, ones that are already shipped. So one of the problems that we're facing, and this is true actually in most standards activities, it's true in most public policy things, and interestingly, it's true in most internet code, is that you're always late. Everything is always late because the stuff has already shipped. If somebody was merely coming along and proposing, right, well, I think that there should be an Internet of Things, everybody would say, yeah, well, we've got problems today that are already in the world, and so we're not going to make policies about those things until you've got an Internet of Things. And then one day you wake up and you realize, oh, dear me, they've shipped these things all over the place. Now what are we going to do? So we actually have to evaluate what's already out there and determine whether there is something that we can do about some of those things. I don't know about all of you, but I have like light switches in my house now that already do these things. And some of them are terrifying to me. I mean, they're terrifying to me partially because I've bought them and installed them specifically so that I can be terrified of them, right? Because I'm testing stuff, because I'm weird that way. But you know, lots of people have this kind of problem, and you want to make sure that we actually respond with reasonable views. There's a question about how to lobby the manufacturers of these things. So this is an actually serious problem, especially in Canada, right? One proposal that that people have floated is that we just, you know, regulate the sale and marketing of the devices in Canada. And I recall a discussion about this last time, and then somebody else pointed out, given that we have like this giant space and fewer people than all of California, the chances that we're going to change the market by simply saying to people, well, we're not going to buy your stuff then, is probably not great. So how are you going to influence them? You've got to give them, what I like to say about the internet, right, is that you got to use only carrots. You don't have any stick. You can't force people to do what you want. And this is an example where we want to bring people along and bring them something that is in it for them so that they get an advantage out of it. There is this idea of rewarding stars, so people who've done a really good job, and how do you do that? So that goes with the previous thing, right? You say, okay, well, here's a carrot. We'll give you an award. Maybe we'll give you an award like because it'll be money in your pocket, or maybe we'll give you an award like free publicity, or there's lots of things. I don't know what they should be, and that's one of the things that we can discuss. And then finally, on our list from last time, we've got this highlighting of use cases and joint solutions and so on. Now, you will notice that I took my jacket off, I rolled up my sleeves and all the rest of that, and that's because we're going to work now. So the idea here is that we've got these 10 things, and I don't know what things people think are really the most important. I don't know what things people want to work on. I have noticed, however, that the lists are very, very quiet. There's not been a lot of discussion of a lot of these things, and we're not going to make any progress unless we pick a few things and start working on them. So we're going to start right now by saying who thinks that these are in the right order, who thinks they're in the wrong order, who thinks that some of these should, you know, become more important, float to the top or whatever. I'm going to open the floor with that. And we even have Tom, who is going to handle the microphone. We are being remotely cast as well, so please wait for the microphone to speak so that other people can hear you. Yes? The microphone is coming. We're pretending to pretend like it's Donahue and it's 1978, right?
Is it on? You can
Yep.
hear me? Okay. Number 8. I'm not saying it's easy.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think in order to make an impact, that needs to go up the priority list.
Okay.
Because ultimately, your effectiveness will be how well you can influence. And it's a whole question of how do you influence and who does it, et cetera. I agree it's difficult, but it needs to move up from my perspective.
Okay. Reactions to that? Uh-huh.
Oh, sorry, no.
No? Oh, okay. No reactions. All right. Over here then.
That wasn't a reaction to that's a new thing.
Okay. So I've got 2 people in queue, over here and then here. Oh, and please also state your name when you start talking. Yep.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut off.
No.
Yeah. So Jordan Melzer. When in our last session we had a topic on network resilience, and I know there hasn't been a lot of traffic on the mailing list, a couple of messages, but I think there's been some offline work by a few folks, and I don't know if anybody would be interested in discussing that today or breaking out into a work group on it, but just to have some dedicated time to actually talk.
So this is a good point, actually. The last time we did have a couple of different topics, and for those of you who weren't at the last meeting, we got a bunch of things. We had breakout sessions, and then we got a bunch of different topics, and then we started coming together, and we came together on what things had we built some consensus around. And we actually didn't get to the network resilience part. So you're right, there is this separate question of network resilience and how we're going to work on it. I think what we're trying to do today is chip away at these things, but I'm certainly prepared to be outvoted because this is the multi-stakeholder world and I don't get to say. So if people really want to split and you know, maybe take the later sessions, we could break this into two pieces. Then we could separate off a chunk on the network resilience and concentrate on that as well.
Hi, I'm Kim Hendy. I wanted to look at number 2 and empower consumers through education and public awareness. I just see that the list is very leaning towards the technology, infrastructure, hardcore side, and I think this has been a history of the internet for a long time. I think it's key to educate, make public aware, because that way, if public is aware, there'll be perhaps more women in a room next time when we do one of these things. And I think that it's key to understanding not only the processes, but the labels, as you say, and promote consumption, right?
Mm-hmm. So could you say a little more about what kind of awareness? So one of the things that worries me a little bit is that, you know, for a long period of time, a lot of people were, for instance, aware of the internet, and the awareness amounted to, wow, that's really weird and geeky, and it's scary and frightening, and it's magic. People have said to me on various occasions, so I should tell you all, I studied philosophy, and I got into this that way, because it's an obvious transition. And so, you know, people have said to me on a few occasions, well, I don't know how you learned all about that. And I was like, I just read a few things. But it occurred to me that a lot of people felt for many years about the protocols on the internet that they were mysterious and frightening and scary. And so, I mean, that's presumably not the kind of awareness we want to create, because these are consumer devices. So what sort of awareness do you think we need to make here? What can we do to make this awareness not this giant bucket right now, right? To me, awareness is huge. I want to make this awareness in a particular kind of sense.
Okay, so how many hours do you want me to talk? No,
we only have so much time, and I will note that there's coffee back there.
No. So. This is an issue that I've researched and is dear to me, and so on and so forth, and I could discuss about it. But basically, as the internet has evolved, and I'm going to talk about from the late 90s,
sure.
The focus of governments and organizations has been an infrastructure in hard programs and tools, because it's tangible, it's easy to sell for funding, it's easy to sell for votes. So what has happened is that when the internet was a highway with 2 or 3 lines of cars going, everybody was like understanding, you know, the things that were there. And what's happened is that as this highway has been populated, you know, I get in my car and I don't really care to know how it, you know,
sure.
functions and all that. And this is the internet. I just want to get in my car and turn it on and go know the 5 things that I need to get where I want. So when I get in the car, right, okay, there's an instruction manual, but there's a guy. I don't read the instruction manual. When you buy the car, you say, how do you open the door? What is the trunk? How does my thumb work and all that? So I believe that, well, I am a person that posits that the multi-stakeholder process could be applied to defining what is going to be the digital literacy of our lives in the future. Because it's not just about technology, it's about understanding the brain process of the thinking of what you can do with technology so it's meaningful. At the same time, you have to be aware and educated of the risks. It doesn't mean that I ain't going to be afraid somebody's going to break in my house, but I need to be aware that if I lock the door, you know, like, I mean, but I was at this conference a day and a half ago, like, then people are afraid of everything that can happen, you know, like just, so I think that there has to be a multiple stakeholder, a multiple layer, and a multi-prong approach to what the internet, what digital is today. And often people just need to know what they need to know, but the spaces have to be available. I had the fortune of being in the government when it was the process of disseminating access, right? Everybody had to be connected, whatever. And there was a multi-pronged approach at the libraries. There was education and awareness opportunities for what you needed. And sometimes it might just be being aware in this room if we were to design a model, for example, a prototype, okay, maybe he is an engineer and knows something to do we need a prototype of something, and I don't know it, but I need it for this design. I don't need to know everything he knows. So I think that the issue of digital adoption and digital awareness has not been able to be tackled by the society because it's difficult. And it's who's going to fund it, who is interested. And why I go back to the connectivity. At the time, we were trying to get all our schools connected to people because everybody. Today, it's not that just people are moving away from the government services, because Mary Jo that needs to find out how to access, she's afraid to get an infected virus. Her, her browser just uploaded and it's a new screen, and she doesn't know what to do. So the government, the people are going away from the usage. The younger generation doesn't really care about security, but they're the holes in the internet of things where hackers are coming in. And so it's not only the government services that you need to access, but now you go to the airports, you have to check in. The banking is almost like online all the time. So there's many stakeholders that now are interested in a digital literate society. So I believe that there is an opportunity, I would say a challenge and a responsibility for everybody that's looking at new developments, call it a new service from the government or a new process involving, that they include how are we going to tackle awareness and education. How is Mary Jo going to know that the toaster that she just brought, she has to just check to see if it's on or off? Well, at the same time, we get our industries to say the standard should be off. So what I'm saying is that there has to be an opportunity where it's campaigns, libraries output, schools, education, a multi-stakeholder approach to say, I just bought a toaster, where can I find out how to use it? You know, sort of like, you see how you go to the geek stores and they'll tell you stuff? This is a new reality, and as we move to this, we need to be able to call, I go to my dealer because and now he has a responsibility of educating. Because the cars now.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so what I've got so far, what we've got is nobody seems to be questioning that the certification stuff should be near the top of this. We've got some suggestion that the empowering consumers needs to remain near the top, and we need to figure out what that is. We've got this suggestion that we need to move the lobbying of manufacturers way up near the top of this. So these are three things that right now I'm hearing those are our sort of top three contenders. So I don't know if everybody agrees with that. Let's find out. Okay, we've got here, here, and here. Oh, and here.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Andrew. My name is Hossein Badran. I would like to say that I agree that the consumer awareness side needs to be moving to the top. It doesn't mean that other issues will fall behind. They may go in parallel, and some issues are linked together, like labeling has to come after certification, for example. What makes sense, you label once you make sure the features are there. But consumer awareness is key, and it has to go, I believe, with multiple types of messages, depending on one factor is the age of the recipient. Messages to children are different than messages to adults, to professionals, and there is history in this kind of approach. I have been part of the Cisco delegation funding or contributing to the Child Online Protection of the ITU Council Working Group. As you know, several years ago, issues of bullying on the internet, addressing targeting children specifically, became quite a global issue, and countries have done national initiatives. So the ITU made it a mission to try to bring messages across and learn from best practices. I think we can capitalize on this. We just need to one additional step. What do you have to do about connected devices, internet, but / connected devices, and I believe. From experience in child online protection, it has been effective. There was a safeguard for children. Parents were engaged. Teachers were engaged. So this kind of messaging has a success history we can capitalize on. We don't have to start from scratch. I'm also chairman of the board of a private school, and we see in the computer labs there are messages on internet etiquette, what to use, what to do on the internet, what information to share, what happens if somebody tries to approach you in an uncomfortable way. So we can capitalize on this as well. Regarding adults, I agree with the with my colleague, with Kim. Yes, I think message to adults have to be concise, clear, and simple. Not to go into technology, not to go into protocols, just how to behave the right way to protect yourself. People are not aware about what type of data they're sharing, what impact this data sharing will cause their financial health issues. So this awareness needs to be there. And what I have heard in many fora, that there's a lack of awareness on the consumer side. I know that ISOC has had a very recent initiative to partner with consumer organizations worldwide, so I think this is something we capitalize on. I'm not sure who's the NGO for consumer protection in Canada. We need to approach these. We have the government as well. So I think the consumer side needs to be quite to the top. And hopefully, as ISOC with all the stakeholders engaged, we can have an impact.
So you're suggesting really that this empowering thing, what's number 2 here,
yes,
that needs to be flipped, that it should be number 1.
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
Yes, nutshell. Thank you.
So I had here. Wait, no, that was not the order. Yeah, it was over here first, and then you. I think I got it. Oh, and I missed you. Sorry, you're here before the fellow in the blue shirt. Right here. No, it's you, I think.
Oh, it is?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, Rob Davidson. Looking at number 7, I believe it is, how to test and evaluate. That tells me what, but what's the who and why? I mean, what seems to be missing here is a discussion of regulations and a regulatory body and where that fits in particular with the new formation of the cybersecurity group in the federal government. Really, there needs to be an infrastructure in place to start testing this stuff on a big scale. And so where's that financing going to come from to do that?
So I'm assuming that that this is input, that what we're producing is input to government decision making, but we can't necessarily tell governments what they're going to do because we're not a sovereign body.
But isn't there an opportunity to define something that's collaborative, that is across multiple?
You're hitting exactly what I was trying to ask. So are you suggesting, therefore, that we need actually to add something here, that we need to sort of define the kind of audience to figure out what the target is, or are you saying that you want to move this testing thing, you want to move that priority up?
Well, I think that the testing is part of something bigger.
Okay.
And if it doesn't have a context, then what does it really mean?
Okay.
So it does need to be part of something bigger.
Okay. Now, how was I doing this? I think you're next, Alan.
Sure.
Hi, it's Alan McGilvery. I'd just like to voice my support with what appears to be the consensus of creating user privacy certification. Like certification would for me be probably first, and certainly consumer empowerment, public education. Since we're not choosing one, I'm not going to debate what the order would be. I also like the idea of moving up what's called how to lobby manufacturers of IoT devices. I know these are outputs of our last meeting, but I think it would serve us well if we changed 8 to say how to engage vendors of IoT devices.
I see what you're saying, yep.
Right. In other words, the people that actually manufacture the Apple products are not Apple, and the people that manufacture the Google products are not Google. And also engage, I think, is a little more collaborative as opposed to lobby. And third, I just like to comment on this gentleman, what the gentleman said here. There are lots of certification systems around the world that don't involve government at all. So it's not a foregone conclusion that if we had if we had standards, a certification system, that there would necessarily be any government involvement beyond the ordinary government support for ISO work. But I'm not talking about a body that would somehow regulate the adherence to those rules. So I don't think we should rule that out altogether, but I think going down the road of government regulation from the get-go is probably get us into trouble. And there's a lot of work to be done around certification and public education in any event. So I think that should be what our focus should be. Thanks.
All right. And next to you is next, I believe.
Chris Parsons. I'm from the Citizen Lab. I just wanted to point to the value of 7, actually. So this is how to test and evaluate devices at scale. So at the lab, one of the things we do is we do rip apart software. We rip apart devices occasionally. And it's time-consuming, hard, and really challenging to do. But it's only when you do that that you get ground truth as to what the world actually looks like right now. It's often a boutique operation right now. And figuring out how to scale that up, I think, is critical, because when you can do that, you can start figuring out, like, well, what should a privacy and security certification label be? Well, until we know what the problems are, it's difficult to say, here's what they should be, and here's how we evaluate passing, middle, or failing, or whatever it looks like. There's different ways of doing it. There's different groups that can do it. Consumer groups have come up previously. Consumer Reports in the US actually has this as part of their mandate to build out a digital standard. But I just want to identify that it's really important to figure out what the world looks like today, because what we want to do is identify, respond to today, as well as address tomorrow. And if we're sort of guessing what today is to project what the future may be, it seems like a bit of building on quicksand.
So there's something really interesting that I just want to draw out of what you just said, because you read this this item completely differently than I did. What I did, right, I've got my propeller head hat on, so naturally what I did is I concentrated on the test and evaluate part of that sentence, and you concentrated immediately on the scale part. That what I was concerned with, like I wasn't too convinced actually that a group of multi-stakeholder people should make up rules about how to test stuff and everything, because quite frankly, it's the tester who's going to make that decision. But your point was rather, oh yeah, well, like I know how to test things, but it's me and 3 other people, and what I want to know is like how 10 million devices are going to get tested. And that's actually a really good point, that only collaboratively can you come up with how you're going to do the scale part. So that's an excellent point. Thank you. Next, I believe we were over here. Well, we're going to go over here just because of the room circulation. So there, and then at the back, and the fellow in the blue shirt. And have I missed anybody?
And we have some people online as well.
Oh, good. Okay. So we'll do that after we get back here.
Hi, my name is Dave Dupuy. I'm with Innovation Science Economic Development. I'm with a small group and Consumer Affairs. I missed your first meeting, but I was made aware of this group, and I was quite interested in in topic number 2, empowering consumers through education. While we're not experts in our office on IoT, we have a vast understanding of the consumer protection framework, and the one thing that jumps out at us quite clearly is just how many different areas are captured by the IoT. So when you start talking about how do you educate consumers? I think some of the best reports we have looking at the full range of consumers issues was put out in 2016 and 17 by Consumers at International. So I'm glad to hear that ISOC has partnered up with them. I think some key things that we can draw from Consumers International work is, well, everyone always talks about privacy and security, and those obviously are very important issues. They also highlight a number of issues that have more to do with functionality, and that's how do you help consumers understand so that their expectations when they buy these devices meet. So you think about the interoperability of devices, or you think about limitations that may be caused by contract terms or digital rights management, or who's liable when something goes wrong, or where do you go when something goes wrong. We did a quick search for what education exists out there right now, and what we found is there's actually a lot of really good information. If you go to the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, they've got some pretty good privacy tips specific to IoT and some specific to wearable devices. Public safety has a Get Cybersecure campaign going on, and internationally there are also some really good examples, but it's just scattered everywhere. And there's no one single place where you can get this type of information. And basically, I suppose if there is a working group put together on the consumer education piece, we would be interested in contributing to that, because right now we just have a lot of questions. do you want to focus just on privacy, just on security, or do you actually want to look at the full range of, you know, what consumers should know before they buy it to ensure that they're happy with their device throughout the whole stage?
And by you, we mean we, right?
Yeah. Yes. And the idea too, like, do you want to target specific types of devices? Do you want to target specific types of consumers, like, you know, old people versus young people? And I mean, in a multi-stakeholder process, what I hope might be possible is not trying to develop education from scratch, but seeing what is the best information that's already out there, and how can we perhaps consolidate it, simplify it, and maybe even make it more effective. Instead of, you know, here are the 19 checklists that you need to read through before you buy this $10 device. Maybe if there was one video that sort of, I don't have all the answer. I have a lot of questions, so I'm really, if there's a working group put together, I would be very happy to participate and actually see it drilled down to, if education is on the table, then how can we drill down to something, because right now with the listserv, it's hard to contribute without knowing what specifically we're going to be doing. You don't know how to contribute to it.
So I think this is a good point, but one of the things that I'm hearing here pretty strongly is you're proposing some work items for a charter for a working group in this area. The first of which is take the stuff that's already out there and put it together in one place so it's easy to access. And that sounds to me like a great charter item for a working group. So thank you. I think that's a great way to start. You feel like I've just given you work, don't you? Well, you're right.
I mean, another thing you could consider as well is you do need the people with the expertise to evaluate just how anyone can put information up on a website, but it also needs to be evaluated and vetted. So you would need some sort of process to do that as well. But right. I mean, as a starting point, if education is the key, to me, I do think let's start with what is already there and how can we make it more effective and bring it together.
Right. Good. So I have two people at the back, and then we're going to go to online. And is there anybody else waiting? Okay.
Thank you. Tracy Lorio from Carleton University. At the last multi-stakeholder consultation, one item that maybe it's in here, but I can't quite see it, was yes, consumer protection, but how do you deal with the aggregate assemblage of all of these things, or how do you deal with it when you're in a context of a smart city, or if you're thinking of Sidewalk Toronto, for instance. This morning I just came from a meeting where, on a research project led by Pamela Robinson at Ryerson, and we looked at the 230 smart city applications to Infrastructure Canada, and what we saw very, very clearly, depending on the scale of the city and the location and the community, a general ignorance of the application of technology and and these is at the city level. And so how do we deal with the public sector? How do we deal with the public aggregation of large technological systems that are going to be deployed? And consumer protection doesn't necessarily cover that. It also doesn't cover some of the bigger issues that we had discussed last time, which was mission creep, the potential for these things to be turned into surveillance, digital rights management. How do you upgrade your city? How do you upgrade your house? How do you maintain all of that stuff? So there would seem to me, and again, maybe it's in here, but I don't quite see it right now. How do you deal with those pieces that are happening right now where there's quite substantial funding going into these areas and there's little or no resources at that scale to help those kinds of actors to deal with more aggregate issues as opposed to just the consumer protection piece of it. And of course I would support the consolidation of research and those kinds of things as well. And this also applies in a precision agriculture environment for rural areas. Mm-hmm. And so what we saw in the 230 was rural areas, small communities, Aboriginal communities, very little knowledge, but we also saw that in some of the big cities that didn't get shortlisted, that, you know, it was just kind of a tick box activity with a very clearly a lack of demonstrable understanding of the kinds of technologies that are going to be deployed at a large systems level. So I would hope that what we saw at the last multi-stakeholder meeting that you held in Ottawa would show up in here somewhere as a priority item, or it gets added into one of these somewhere.
So I think what you see, you'll notice that it says including, and we were trying to restrict ourselves to only 10 items on the thing so that we could come down to like 3 things that we could walk out of this room to work on. But it sounds like what you're arguing is that there's a sort of aggregation piece of this that is cutting across it, that is missing from this, and you think that that's a more important priority than some of the other ones that are listed here. So now the question that I'm going to have for you is, do you think that that's more important than the top 3 that we seem to be converging towards?
I would see it would be a top 4.
Okay.
I wouldn't want to replace the 3, or it's consumer and aggregate protection, and then we get into the aggregate in that particular kind of context. Sorry,
I see.
I'm already
Okay.
loud as it is. Yeah.
Well, so there is I mean, there are 2 ways to look at this, right? One has to do with the way that the aggregation affects individuals, and I think that that's covered in the consumer side here in some sense. Let me finish the other half, and then you'll see what I'm saying. There's the other piece of it, which is the sort of emergent property of the total aggregation of all of the things, and that is definitely missing on this list. I agree with you that well, to put it maybe a little more crudely, the sort of big 5 internet companies today have not only a great deal of knowledge that they can infer about you individually, even though they're not necessarily getting it out of disclosures from you, but also they've got sort of large-scale knowledge about everyone and the sort of group consequences of that. And the first one, you could argue, is somehow covered about by consumer protection or something like that. Although at the moment, maybe the rules don't work very well for that. But you can at least argue it's in the topic. But the second one, the sort of aggregate control over the culture, is not here, and maybe you're arguing that that's a different topic that needs to be included somehow. Is that fair?
Yes, except that consumer and citizen or resident are very different things.
Yeah. So
right?
I grant
so
you
to me,
yeah.
that point I think needs to be pretty clear.
Right.
Because as a citizen, as our institutions are perhaps the consumer of these large systems, I, at the end, I'm not behaving like a consumer when I'm
Right.
dealing with my city and I'm interacting with these devices and then these larger kind of public issues
Right.
that are at the intersection of that. So I think we're sort of there, but I think citizen, resident is key. It's different than consumer. And then the second part, I absolutely agree with you.
So I think there's an important thread that I want to mark it and then move on from this. But and that is the way that the developers or vendors, as we were pointed out earlier, stand in relation to the consumers of this thing. That doesn't mean customers, but rather the people who are consuming the thing, is in a producer-consumer sort of relationship. But your point is partially that as the producer of this thing is more and more ubiquitous, that is, it's in the walls and so on, it's very hard to regard the person just happening to walk by as a consumer in the traditional sense, because they're not making a choice. So there's no choice of engaging with the thing. Yeah. Okay. So that's good. There's one more before we go there. The fellow in the blue shirt here. So you're on the list, and I had somebody else, and you're on the list too. Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Terry Ansari, and I was thinking about item 7, and I really believe that the at-scale piece, when we talked in the first meeting, is really the operative phrase there. When we had that conversation, at scale was central to the dialogue, and I believe that if we don't consider it literally at the top or a 3A kind of conversation, everything else kind of will ripple from the results of that. In other words, there's proof there. And in the absence of proof, we're going to get what we kind of got in some of the sessions on Tuesday at the Digital Access Day with the Internet Society, which was a lot of fear. And if you try to teach people by fear, they just blank out, and that's a real risk. But if I can show something at scale that's an aggregation conversation that also deals with awareness, deals with engagement, I have a different opportunity to actually say, and it's more than Canadian, it transcends boundaries, because then it's something we're contributing back to the entire community, and I think there's real value in really considering that as a tangible opportunity as opposed to a policy-driven or an awareness kind of minded construct.
So are you suggesting that the testing at scale needs to move up, or are you rather saying that this at scale principle needs to cut through all of these other priorities that we're setting?
I think I'd like to see the testing move up to itself, but I take your point that it is cross-cutting. You know, a lot of what we're talking about here is curation and obviously aggregation. I mean, these are things that we can do very well. Having the convening ability to bring the story together is really vital and really important. If we don't put a there, though, we'll end up with this sort of soupy thing. So that's why I'd say I'd suggest strongly that we find some way to hone in on that and make it stick, or at least make it something that is Canadian, that could be not just exported but also embraced by others and maybe built out that way.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to go online, and then I have here, 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 and there. Right? Did I miss anyone? You're off now?
No, I'm on. Sorry.
No, you're right after the people online.
I have one comment from Fouad Khan, and he says he wants to mention that CSA Group has created a program to address the certification problem. It's called the CVP Cybersecurity Verification Program, and it's currently being piloted. The goal is to make this a Canadian standard later this year and then target international groups after that. And it would be in ISO and IEC. So he'd like the group to kind of figure out how that can be used as a part of this process also.
So this goes partially to this question of three here about which standards bodies and so on, and that suggests to us, right, that we don't need to create another standards body, which is a great relief to me. Okay, let's come here for next.
I'll wait patiently.
Yeah.
Sorry, Tom. Thanks. My name's Tamir. I'm just trying to think of if there's a way to consolidate a little, and I hope this doesn't break anything, but I'll just put it out there and people can say what they think. Particularly, I was thinking of engaging with manufacturers, whether that could be consolidated into either, you know, the whatever strategic intervention is thought of when trying to address, you know, what an accurate certification mechanism looks like, but also as a way of, you know, if they're willing to engage, of addressing some of the testing and evaluation issues up front. So like getting, again, like this is going to be, if they're not willing to engage, then we're not going to be able, it's not going to work. But if they're willing to feed into the process and give, like, if we're looking at addressing specific problems and they're willing to provide some information about those specific problems, that might be one way to address that up front, not at scale, but probably in a more targeted way. So there would have to be some scoping around that. But if that was possible, that might be one way of like addressing that. Another way is actually like of potentially consolidating that one as well as the testing and evaluation one might be to consider whether the certification mechanism, I know that this is an issue with certification mechanisms because it actually deters certification sometimes, but include some sort of testing and evaluation into the certification mechanism. The other consolidation thought I had was to Tracy's point on there could be two streams of consumer education, one that is very targeted around like consumer to device interactions and what kind of thoughts and considerations should go into that, and one into there is another consumer relation, and it was kind of discussed at the first meeting, but I don't think anyone came up with a good idea of how to work it in because it's very difficult. But it really is kind of what we were talking about, which is consumer to government, but the government is then the customer, or the city is the customer, or whatever. But like how to like provide public education that can not, we don't want to scare people, but like, you know, provide for authoritative and informed debate around that, and that might be a useful thread in there, or at least for a working group that's looking at how to educate consumers, might look at whether there's like a room to have two education threads there. I think that's all I had. The last thing I was just coming off, if there is an actual CSA standard that's being worked on that's looking specifically in IoT, one thing might be to consider whether it might make sense to provide strategic input into that or not. But yeah, anyways, those are all the consolidation thoughts I had. I don't know if any of those are helpful or if they just kind of break everything we've been going on until now.
I don't think so. I think in particular that what that suggests is that we want to concentrate on getting some working groups going so that we can make some real progress on this and try to figure out like for each working group. Because what we're going to do this afternoon, I'm telling you, I swear I'm going to make you all do this, is people are going to get together and they're going to work out, sort of pieces of a charter, and we're going to put those to the mailing list, and we're going to say, here's this working group, and they're going to work on these things, and those of you who are going to be there, I'm going to take your names, so you're going to work on them, and that way we can, we can have some concrete things that we can start to propose. And I think one of the things we have to do at that point is sort of say, what are we going to do first? Because this is almost an right. It's internet and things. Okay, well that's like all the stuff in the universe. So we're going to have to start with something, and cut this off one piece at a time. So I think that's one of the pieces that we're going to try to do in the next step. What time are we?
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. Okay, so we got half an hour for this bit yet, and I have 1, 2, 3. Oh, you're going to go to shot. So that's not a hand. You're just pointing at. I see. That's good. Okay, good. Okay, so yes, Jacques.
Jacques Lato, here, yeah. So the question I had is the definition of IoT, because based on the discussion we've had so far, I heard IoT as being an individual device, a bunch of devices, an application that IoT is part of, a system, a smart city, and the entire internet.
Well, it's not the last thing.
And then if we do security, and then if we want to do security of these different components, well, there's different framework and different application for all of them. And if we're not in sync on what we're talking about for IoT, then there's a risk that whatever the discussion are not going to be focused entirely on what we want to do. So what's the definition of IoT?
So I have 2 responses that I want to give to that before I throw this open to everybody else. My first response is IoT has ever been and always will be a marketing term rather than an actually useful definite description, because the point of it really is that it's, I mean, from the point of view of a nerd like me, right? The IoT is just sensors and actuators that you've hooked up to the internet somehow. And if that's a boring description to you, I can see why. But the other thing that I would say about it is, of course, to me, the internet is a network of networks, but the internet to, say, my mother is not that. It's the weird thing where she goes on and she turns it on, and the internet to my nephew and niece is the world in which they live. So, I think that these are terms that are going to end up being extraordinarily flexible. But I take your point, and that is any working group is working on a particular issue is going to have to bound very carefully precisely which issue they're working on at any given time. Because if you want to talk, and I think this goes exactly to the point that we were, the little discussion we were having earlier about the distinction between the consumer of a device, the consumer of an embedded thing that's in the wall as you walk by, and the consumer of an embedded thing in the sidewalk, which you literally cannot avoid. That's now part of your environment, and it's very hard to think of you as a consumer under those circumstances. So those are different kinds of environments. So I think that that's a really important point that we need to make over and over again. I bet we'll have to make it at least a dozen more times. So I think you were next.
This last little piece of yours was a perfect segue. I wanted to bring forth the elements of discussion of my colleague and of the gentleman there in mentioning that when I look at number 2 and how to empower, the words that resonate to me is empower, public education and awareness. And the issue that consumer is there is like a semantic something to indicate a human being, basically. So for me, it's the education and awareness of every human being, because the education and awareness, not awareness, but the education of the stuff or the robots is somebody else is taking care of that. So coming back to that and the consumer name, that's why I like to talk about digital literacy and the users and the citizens, because we are all consumers of a pacemaker, of the traffic lights, of the something in the smart city. So we're all consumers of stuff that sometimes we choose or not. And so that is like for a semantic word. Just for me means a citizen, a person. And so the awareness and education and the empowerment, for me a big word is empowerment, is let's say, of people, call it whatever you want. And so when you're talking about it's a different awareness, no, it's the same. It's the same, it's not the same piece, but the concept of developing some type of multi-stakeholder approach to tackle the issues of developing digital literacy of whatever it is for the people and at all levels in this age, empowering through education and awareness, I think it's key.
So I agree with you, but I want to push back a little bit about this idea that it's just the same. Because it seems to me, for instance, that when I'm choosing whether I'm going to buy a dishwasher that is connected to the internet, and also whether I'm going to turn that feature on, versus whether I'm going to, like, say, live in the city of Toronto, you know, those are a different scale. And one of them has very much more agency, right? I get to choose that thing. Whereas if my neighborhood is wired, particularly if I'm already living there, it's maybe a little different in the case of the Sidewalk Labs case, because you could decide, no, I just want to avoid that neighborhood. It's going to be hard. It's a lot of the city, but you know, that's one of the things you have to. You could maybe make a decision. But I live in a part of the city that is being wired in a different way, and that is being wired whether I like it or not, and I already live there. And I can't afford to sell my house, so like I'm sort of stuck with it. And that sort of suggests that there's a difference that I think is an important one we ought to attend to, right?
What I'm trying to say is that in both cases, awareness and education are important for your understanding and to empower you to do whatever. Choose the whatever it is at the moment. It's not that I'm saying it's the same awareness and education, but I'm saying the issue of you being aware, now it's wired like this, blah, 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 blah. The issue of you being aware that now the washing machine, if you this, and this. So this, what I'm saying is that the content of being aware and being educated is a component that is required across the board. It's not the same. You know what I mean?
Yep.
We're saying the same thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
Or anyway, similar enough that it's good enough. All right, I'm not seeing anybody right now who desperately wants to say something. Going twice? All right, good. So, what I've heard here is now I've got sort of a top 4. And that's going to be tough if we're going to limit ourselves to 3 things. So we're going to have to make some choices. So what I've got, one thing that's interesting to me is that very few people seemed to disagree with the idea that this creation of labeling and so on for consumers, a kind of awareness campaign that requires sort of designations of these things. Nobody seemed to think that that's controversial, and in fact many people seemed to think that that was number 1, but nobody wanted to talk about it. So that's a very interesting point, because maybe that means it's not number 1, or maybe it means that it's so easy that we could just knock it out this afternoon, right? Yeah. So that was the first one that's already here. We had this how to empower consumers through education and public awareness campaigns. And some people seem to think that that ought to go first or second, but I mean, it seemed to stick in our top 3. We had this point about how we're going to engage with the vendors of these things, the way to engage them. And people wanted to move that up. They wanted to move it somewhere near the top here because engaging with them seemed to be a necessary condition for getting any of the other stuff to work. Like, for instance, not going to be very useful to have this complicated, labeling system if no vendor will put it on their box. That's going to be very, very useless. And as I suggested at the beginning, the answer is probably not for us to say, not going to do it. And then finally, I had this idea that the testing and evaluation at scale, and in particular the scale stuff, needed to move near the top. And then the question was whether that scale piece was cutting across everything or whether it was something that needed to be considered independently. So those are the top 4 that I've got right now from this discussion, and how people are going to cut it off. So we've got somebody here, 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 and here. So let's just go across the room. And did I miss anybody? No? Okay. Unless that's a hand. Nope? Okay.
So before you label, you do need to know what the label, not what it means to somebody, but also what you have to do to
Yes.
get there. I realize there is some work in progress on that. I'm not sure that, I think it's important to continue work towards better practices in the first place. And so as item number 5, I would like to keep a work group on network resiliency and those sorts of topics alive in some forum.
Yeah, so, and I actually really liked the recommendation from Tamir was that basically 7 and 8, testing and lobbying or engaging vendors is part of number 1, because you would want to include that as part of any certification system that you're either, whether or not you're evaluating an existing one or creating a new one, you would want to see whether or not there is some kind of capability for testing and that it is something that vendors are willing to engage with. The network resilience, which I also support maintaining, is just the 3rd.
Look at that. We just got down to, we went from 4 to 3 and we added a topic. That is some good alchemy. So I think you're 5th because I've still got 2 more here, here and here. Yeah.
Thank you. So I just like to comment a bit on this testing and testing to scale. We all bring our own frame to this when we come to this. There is an interaction, I think, between what the standard would be and what the testing would be. So for example, there's a scenario under which the standard is only that the device be upgradable. Okay, so if that's what the standard is, then the testing required to determine compliance is very simple. All right, if the standard is much more complex, getting into you know, researching, embedding, coding, obviously the testing is going to be much more complicated. So I just wanted to make that point, but also too, having a simple or a complex standard, they're not mutually exclusive. Rather, you could have certain devices, if it has this function, you know, have a simple standard, or a more complex, important, you know, sensors on traffic lights or something, may have a more sophisticated standard and hence testing. So, but I'd always seen where we were is trying to kind of start small, and this is where the use of the word scale gets a little complicated depending on how you're using it. Yes, we want to be mindful is if we went for a small, a simple standard, is it scalable? If we succeed, actually we want to keep that in mind. And so that's one concept of scale. The other word concept I wanted to put out is there are existing standards and certification systems which actually do not require testing of all the devices, but rather it's what they call type approval. In other words, one example is tested. If it meets the standard, the vendor is allowed to say that all of them meet that. So scale may not be an issue if that's the way you're looking at it. So I'd want to stay away from the scale until we've got the simpler world figured out. Thank you.
So we have one more here and then you. Nope.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. I'd like to support.
Oh, and just remind people, because the remote people won't know who you are if you don't say your name.
Okay.
Thanks.
My name is Hossein Badran. I just wanted to support the idea that the testing and evaluation is linked to the labeling task, so they could be very well in one direction. The scale is certainly an issue, and back in the many years ago, there was the ATM forum or the Frame Relay forum, now multi-service forum, where basically they put together interoperability documentation that shows how multi-vendor environment can coexist, and they have specific testing scenarios for these interoperability specifications. So that could be an approach, but of course this is a very intensive undertaking and requires significant commitment from vendors to set the specification and then to adopt it in their products. I think this is a very huge undertaking. But the type approval, I agree, it's a simpler approach, and as being used, for example, for wireless devices, make sure that the power rating is below harmful limits. So this could be an issue, could be an approach. So before we go into exactly what we tested, I agree, need to see what the specifications look like, what characters needs to be verified, but the testing and labeling, I think, need to go together. And the infrastructure part, certainly an issue. Coming from a technical background, technology always exists to solve any specific problems. Once you identify what the problem is, so you can find technical solution, network architecture that conforms. We now just need to be mindful of the cost, not to be inhibitive for, we're talking the average consumer, not to inhibit him from adopting such a solution. Thank you.
Okay. So I have Kim next.
Thanks, Kim Hendy. I was just wondering in number 8, I wasn't here for the first discussion, but how to engage vendors. That could also be part of the education and public awareness. You definitely want to engage the vendors. So I'm not sure what was the original view of this, but we've already engaged the vendors, I think, in the first. So I would also see to engage vendors in the education and awareness.
So here, and then here, and here.
Tracy Lorio. So back to my original point, I wonder if that one point could be consumer, public sector procurement and deployment in public space, public education. Maybe that could be a nice consolidation of those.
Paul wants to talk and he's here.
Oh.
My original point, I wonder if one point could be public sector procurement and deployment.
There's a big delay because what I'm seeing on the screen is not what I am.
So you mute your stuff and talk.
Okay.
You're on.
All right. This comes back to the, hopefully you can hear me okay. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. It comes back to the labeling. So just some background on the whole CSA kind of approach on this, just for education, because I think it's very relevant to the topic that everyone's talking about on certification and labeling. So CSA, as you know, a very well recognized organization who does a lot of certification, electrical certification testing and evaluation. So they've come up with like a cybersecurity verification process. It's 3-pronged. So basically what it starts with is a self-assessment to a vendor organization. And so that company goes through this typically at the request of a customer. And they complete self-assessment questionnaire. It's about 100 or just under 200 questions. So once they complete that, then that goes for an assessment by CSA staff. At which point they make a determination if the company is viable to actually go to phase 2, which is an audit. So whatever that company claims on that questionnaire actually will then be verified by CSA technicians. Now, if they go through that process and that also is graded to an acceptable level, and they do have gradings for this, by the way, for maturity levels, then they will continue to do what's called a penetration test and other testing. So they will test like the radios, they will test interoperability, they will test a formal like security testing as well. And so that whole area then results into a certification. And so they will basically, not right now because they're working on this, but the goal is to make this a Canadian standard. And then once they do that, then they're in the position to actually put a label on it and provide you with what's called an attestation letter to the vendor. And so that vendor can then use that across the country to anyone else who basically says, we've gone through a formal evaluation process. So I think that's very, or a key way for organizations to show that they have all of those requirements. The other piece I will add is it doesn't just look at the product. It looks at the company. It looks at how they develop. And I think this comes back to a point that Alan had indicated is, you know, once you show the company has the proper processes in place, you can basically make the assumption that any product that they develop is going to be secure, it's going to be private, it's going to interoperable, it's going to be resilient, and all those other aspects of like trustworthiness. So I think that is key, and why this program right now is being evaluated by quite a few different product companies, and some of these companies are really big name companies that are under the program right now. We're looking to do this evaluation, and it's really being driven by the utility companies in the country. So I think it's really, really important to kind of just look at this. It's one piece, but I think it's an important piece that needs to be considered. And I think the awareness piece is there as well, because they're really trying to get out there and make the industry aware, not only at the consumer level, but at the business level. What do they need to look at when they're evaluating, considering a solution? So thank you very much.
So this is going to be hard because there's such a long delay. What I'm going to suggest that we do is we need to think about whether this is a certification and labeling piece that can effectively replace the multi-stakeholder one, and we can just say somebody's already doing this, we're going to use their thing, and it could be that what needs to happen is an evaluation of that, whether it's appropriate for our purposes or whether what we're talking about is a different set of things that we're trying to communicate, right? Because there is a distinction between, for instance, just having the CSA sticker on the back, which is what your insurance company tells you have to have, versus deciding, oh, well, is this appropriate for my use, right? And what I do when I put, say, an electrical appliance in the wall, I just trust my electrician to know that they're following the code, and the building code has all of these things in it. So I don't, I'm not literally making a choice at that point, because I've just really delegated the choice to somebody who's got a certification. But on the internet, that's much harder to do because there are no internet police, unlike building police. And so that's a distinction that maybe we're going to need to think about. So that would be something that I would suggest people who are interested in working on this in the working group, that would be one of the questions that we need to answer. Walter.
Yes, it's Walter. If I look at all of this activity here and have to go back and figure out, like, what is the ultimate output of this whole effort and what are the stakeholders? And in my mind, there's like 3 broad camps, but they're they depend on each other. So like, think of a triangle, right? At one point you have the individual, it could be a citizen, consumer, whatever. Someone that's either forced into or chooses IoT environment. Another corner is the IoT, we call it manufacturers, but more broadly, provider. You could call it vendor, but provider. It could be product, could be service, whatever. And then on the other, third point on that triangle is regulators, right? And so all that to say is that I think that the service provider, in influencing them, understanding their needs and them understanding the objectives and kind of the guidelines that we set forward, needs to be at the top, along with the certification and the public awareness.
Okay, so right now, what I see we have are 5 minutes. And so what we've got now is a proposal for effectively 3 working groups, right? And one of them is about this labeling stuff, which encompasses necessarily how you're going to test these things, what the testing looks like, and so on. And also how you're going to engage with the vendors or providers, if you like, in order to get them to agree to this sort of thing. So that was one that I heard. A second one was the sort of design and promulgation of the education and awareness campaigns, a sort of digital literacy. We've had that as well. And of course, one of the questions for that working group is who it is that their target's going to be, and for what kinds of things. So what sorts of problems are you going to tackle initially, and so on. So that was a second thing. And then the third thing was the network resilience. How are we going to protect the network itself from these things, and how are we going to protect these things from the network? I think that those were the top 3 that seem to have emerged from this discussion so far. So that's what I'm going to propose that people think about a little bit while you have coffee and snacks and so on, unless somebody really wants to object to my description of what I heard as the emerging consensus here. I'm seeing no objections, and I can't tell whether that's because you're all dying for coffee or because you actually agree with me. Okay. Okay. So that's right. We're not gonna hum, but so let's break for half an hour, and we'll come back about 3 o'clock. It's 28 past or something right now, right? So we'll come back about 3 o'clock, and we can figure out who's going to do what. Thank you. So we have this idea that we've got 3 things that we're going to work on, right? One of them is this labeling stuff, what we're going to do about labels, and how we're going to, within that, we're going to, how we're going to engage with the suppliers or the vendors or the providers or whatever we want to call it, and how we're going to test those things, and whether that's just reuse of somebody else's certification mechanism, such as the CSA one that's being developed, or whether there's something specific that we want to achieve out of that. So that's one working group. Then we've got a second one which has to do with this, this education and awareness component. And then we've got a third one, and that one has something to do with network resiliency, how the network is resilient in response to this environment of all of these things that are on it, and also how the things are resilient in the face of network attacks and providing the things and so on. Notice that those are actually completely different problems, right? The one is you've got all these devices and maybe the zombie apocalypse comes. So we geeks, we call it the zombie apocalypse because these things go zombie, right? They die and they just kind of float around on the network, and that can attack the rest of the network. But you've got the problem in the other direction too. So there's a problem about, for instance, do your light bulbs still work after a certain amount of time? Because one of the things a certain number of geeks have proposed is that they have a death built into them, so that the device just dies after, say, 5 years because it's too dangerous and we don't believe that the support's going to be there. So it's a mandatory requirement that if you're going to plug this into the electrical system, just for instance, then the thing after 5 years, it will simply stop working. And you think about some scenarios there, it's kind of amusing, for instance, to imagine that you've got the front porch light on in order to identify to the coming ambulance that this is where the heart attack is happening, and the 5 minutes stops in the middle, or the 5 years stops in the middle of that, and the light turns off. That would be a bad thing. So that's an example of the sort of issues that could be there. That's a different kind of resilience than the problem on the network and so on. So those, I think, are the 3 big ones. Does anybody disagree with those at the topmost level? Okay, so what we're going to do, I've got, I didn't really have a place to put it, so it's up here to the right, and I'm going to peel these things off as we go. What I want to do is try to nail down some topics. And the reason we're going to do this in plenary is because we've got about 20 remote participants. And so I can't just divide you up because we don't have that many microphones and we don't have a way to communicate with everybody and so on. And it is the internet after all. And the idea is that this is the sort of limitation, the boundary conditions for these for 3 working groups that we're going to try to set up today. And we're going to try to find people who are interested in them. So what I propose to do is to try to slice up the topics that we want to put into these things, and then people are going to express their interest, and I'm going to take your names. We got a chart. I don't know where it went. It's on a clipboard, and people are going to be able to sign up for it, and we're going to pass that around. So I'm just warning you, this is coming, and you can't slip out before because we're going to lock the doors. You think I'm kidding. Okay, so the first thing is this labeling thing. And so I propose that one topic for it is deciding whether there is a label to be developed or if this is just a label to be identified and used. Is that a fair thing? Does anybody want to? Yes.
And there might be another option in there, which is to find a way to strategically. Sorry. Another option there might be to strategically feed into a label or creation process, assuming that there's one out there, but not solve it for them, but say identify a specific thing that we can feed into a process that's being developed. Okay, so you're saying there are really 3 options here: build one,
build one ourselves, find somebody else's, or align with somebody else to develop something collaboratively with a bunch of other people. Okay, so the first thing I see here what I put here is develop, use, or collaborate. Okay, is that a fair thing? All right, so that's one thing that it has to do. A second thing maybe that this thing has to do is figure out how to engage with the providers of these things. So that includes manufacturers, vendors of devices, resellers of devices, online people who do things, weird open source people who get together on the internet and make stuff and put it on GitHub and never release another update for it after 10 years. I've never done that. So is that another thing, like how to engage with the people? Is that these people have this topic? Because remember, we're dividing up the universe here, so nobody else gets to, I mean, among our working groups, we're gonna say that's where that thing is gonna be worked on. Nobody's objecting. This is the most compliant multi-stakeholder group like there's no way I've got two things and like nobody's objected to anything yet. Fair point.
It would be impolite to.
Okay, so I've got this interact with providers. Now, another thing we talked about before was this testing question. Do we want the testing, the identification of the testing to live here? Do we think that the testing itself is just none of their business because other people are developing the testing and they should just identify the tests? Is this the place that lives? Are you here because you need to, somebody's got something online? Oh. No. Oh. Okay. You won't be able to read it anyway. I'm writing it down. I haven't been able to write for more than 10 years now. I type everything, right? If there were a giant typewriter up here, I'd be okay. So I put here, identify tests and develop if needed. Or develop the tests if we need them.
And testers.
And testers too, okay? Good, this is excellent.
Or mechanisms for.
Okay.
Or mechanisms for to make it a potential ongoing process, recognizing that it's going to be an iterative. There might be a need for a mechanism to iteratively identify what tests are needed, and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Now, the last topic that seemed to fit into this thing was this issue of scale. We had the emphasis on the scale rather than the testing as such. And originally in our list, those were sort of bound together. So I'm wondering if the scale issue belongs here or if it belongs somewhere else.
And yeah, so I guess I would say, as far as like the fourth or last, if there is a last component, it is something in the realm of adoption, scale, and like the public or the outward-facing element of this, which is why I actually think we could roll up number 9 as far as showcasing IoT stars, right? That there would be some element of this where you would be able to, on a, like, considering we're on like the full industry-wide scale here, be able to see who is doing what, again, assuming that people are adopting.
So this is interesting. You go ahead first.
in case this is going to be the last point there, but in furthering up in
We
life.
have more paper.
Okay, good. Because in this process of doing the outward component, is there an awareness and education component here in how to read the labels that this group also develops to feed into other parts?
So these are 2 points that I think are both interesting, and they strike me actually as, from my point of view, the same question. My natural response to that is that both of those things have to do more with awareness and education than they have to do with this sort of testing and labeling as such. That is, to me, this working group, whatever we're going to call it, I was joking during the break that we'll use the traditional geek approach of naming them Alice, Bob, Charlie, but maybe that would be confusing to everybody else. In any case, I'm thinking that this has to do with like what you put on the box or how you identify these things. And the stars, the communication about who's doing things, that sort of showcasing thing has more to do with the outward-facing thing of how do you, raise awareness, how do you make people able to make these decisions and so on. So this is the sort of information content, as it were, and the other one has more to do with the process by which you put the thing across. That was what I was thinking, but I don't know what your reaction is to that.
I believe that in the new way of doing these things, the people that are developing that have to know that it's going to be communicated outward. So they're going to have to provide the content for the awareness and education group to perhaps provide the how and the when. But when the technical people are designing and implementing, they have to be preparing the communication, or at least the content. So what I'm trying to say is that if you're going to be designing a label that's going to be impossible to educate people upon, so in the design you have to have the user in mind. Because the testing, no, but we're talking about labels here, right?
Yes.
Labels for devices. So there's a component that it doesn't apply, right? So the testing would not apply to what I'm trying to say. But if we're talking about labels for devices, in that part, it has to be designed with the user in mind.
Yes.
So
let me just pause for a moment and point out, there's no requirement that people pick one of these things to participate in, right? You could participate in all of them, and that would be great. So there does need to be some cross-pollination. I completely agree with that. And you're quite correct that there is a usability component here that has to apply. I don't think anybody was disagreeing with that.
In some instances, if these groups provide the content that then another group will use to provide all the programs, that's fine. But you have to be aware that there has to be a communication of how people are supposed to read the label, right?
Yep.
Jacques Lato. So in my little magic crystal ball, the future, I think the internet, the IETF is working on a new protocol which is called MUD, which is Manufacturer Usage Description. And that specification is meant to define what the IoT device is, how it's supposed to behave inside your home network or the enterprise. But for a water sensor, the way you implement MUD is with a sticker on an IoT device with a QR code. And when you scan that QR code, it brings you to a website to say, this is a profile of the IoT device. So in the future, we plan on putting stickers on every device because we like putting stickers everywhere. But we're going to put stickers on every IoT device, and maybe at the same time we do MUD, we should have a way to educate the user to say if it's a purple sticker, it means this, or a blue sticker. But in the end, every device should have stickers to identify what they are.
And do you think that belongs in this?
Well, if MUD, no, but the stickers that people will see, yes.
Okay.
The label needs to mean something to. When you look at the sticker and you look at it should be holographic and it should be whatever.
So I see Alan also, so I'm going to give Alan a chance first.
Well, having heard from FOD online about what the work the CSA is doing, and now Jacques' example, I wonder if we should just limit ourselves by saying we will not have made in Canada standards, okay, and accept the reality that they will come, there'll have to be some process to accept them, if you know what I mean, but the actual standards development work would not occur here, because that would shrink the amount of work that we would be doing. And just, I mean, there might be a process of examining those for their, I guess, their applicability in Canada, but then that would leave us more focused dealing with consumer education, how to ensure, what's the mechanism for ensuring compliance, is that the right word, with standards, adherence to standards. So just a suggestion, thank you.
So you're suggesting that this needs to be only about conformance or adherence and not about the development of the standards as such?
Yes, that's the, well, there might be a process which examines the international standards for the validity, is there, but actually reverse the onus. Is there anything in this standard being developed that would be inappropriate or in the Canadian context?
Okay.
Or something like that, so shrink the work to be done, maybe reverse the onus? Yeah.
Okay. Kim?
Oh, there's Spot. Oh, Spot's here.
Oh, okay. So we had, but I think Kim was first.
I was just going to briefly say that in this concept of having different labels or different colors to mean different things, it's obviously a technical group that is going to be defining what each label means. So, I mean, it can't be the awareness group that knows what to put in each label, right? So if it has a category, if it does expire, or the technical aspects is what the label will reflect. So it's, for me, it's in that group,
okay.
You know what I mean?
Fun.
I just wanted to, it's FOUDCON, by the way. I was online, I'm now in the room. So to Alan's point, I think when you look at just what the whole, and I agree with you, we shouldn't create any standards, because I think lots of groups are taking that on, and we don't want to do that because we'll boil the ocean and just waste a lot of time on that. But I think what we need to do is come up with our requirements for what that is, right? And I think from that, then you say, okay, what are the things important to the Canadian consumer? What is important to Canadian business? And then what's important to Canadian government? And then those requirements then determine which standards groups, and even specific requirements who might not necessarily be a standard are then considered, I think, for the program as we look at it. And that's how we require it, whether it's the labeling, whether it's the awareness, all those kind of things. And I think that's the easier way to look at this problem from that perspective. If you look at just the work that's being done, I know like IEEE is doing this, ISO's doing this, IEC is doing this, and there's things from interoperability to security to privacy to user interfaces to specific things, deployment scenarios. I don't think we get into that. I think that is really going to waste a lot of our time. So focus on the awareness piece. How do we strategically reach those markets? And so if it's a consumer, how do we get to the consumers in the areas that we think we should get there? And then there's also the businesses, right? I think businesses are who are looking to buy IoT want to get into it, but it's security and privacy is one of those key elements. So what can we educate them on how to evaluate a provider, for example, solutions, those kind of things. I think those are the key aspects that we should be looking for. And there is information out there that we can use to build on.
So I understand this, but it sounds to me like you're suggesting, well, maybe I don't understand you. It sounds to me like you're suggesting that actually the top three that we'd come up with before, this sort of the content of the labels sort of thing, the awareness piece, and the network resiliency, that you actually want to throw away number one and just work on the awareness and the network resiliency. Is that correct?
No, it's not correct.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, focus on those areas, but do it from a requirements perspective, right? So what are the requirements for label? What are the requirements for awareness? So we understand that. So if, for example, if you're going to say use this specific standard, I don't necessarily know that we're at the stage where we say use a specific standard. What we should say is, if you have this classification of product, here's the standards you should consider. Here's the certifications you should consider, and then that determines the label that you use.
So you're saying that you don't want this group to develop. I think this is similar to what Alan was saying, that you don't want this group to develop standards as such.
That's right.
Yeah,
yeah.
My impression is that that's a complete consensus in this room.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I'm saying is, even if I think we still need to evaluate what the current standards are. Okay? And from that, though, but prior to doing that, you need to create your requirements to say, okay, what is the consideration for those standards? Because that will then drive, the labels that you look at, the awareness that you need to create, all those things. So it's almost like stepping back to just say, what are the requirements for label? What are the requirements for awareness? And then that should drive then the outputs from those. That's what I'm saying. So it's almost just stepping back just a little bit to understand what those things are. Look at there's volumes of this work that's been done for years. So I'm also saying, don't go boil the ocean again, trying to rediscover all this stuff. Let's look at all the papers that have been done in IEEE, in ISO, and IEC, in the EU. Use those as our inputs, and then create our small list of requirements. From that, that'll drive our requirements for labeling, for awareness, everything else.
So what I think I'm hearing, because remember, what I'm trying to do here is distill these points down so that when we leave the room later, we can write these things down as charters for working groups that then we can have people who have already signed up. Remember, I'm going to hand those things around. Have I mentioned that already? That we're going to have these charters so that people have a crisp idea of what each working group is working on, so that if they come later, they can join. So what I hear are 2 points that you're making here. One is this thing like, what are the requirements for a label? What does each label mean? And that's a thing that this working group has to determine. And a second thing is a principle. That is, it's going to, wherever possible, it's going to reuse work that other people have already done. Does that capture what you're, okay. So does anyone disagree with those? Yes.
Not a disagreement, but I might be picking up also kind of developing a conceptual map as to when to apply, use these kinds of standards, right? So I'm looking at a geosync conceptual standards map here that does that kind of thing. So is that right? Is that, okay.
So you want a conceptual map of the standards out of this working group?
So that people know when to use them, how to use them, the time to use them, at what device level, systems level, network level, et cetera.
And you're saying that you've already found one. This could be a small bit of work then.
I have one here to give you an example of standards mapping on smart cities and open data, but just to see what the conceptual mapping could potentially look like and what that kind of database might actually look like.
So what I've written down here is a conceptual map of standards, know when to apply the standard to a device or service. Yep.
I think within that, though, again, as well as where there might be some gaps. I think identify, like if there are gaps. I'm not sure that there are. There are a lot of standards out there. It could be just pointing to ones that are under development that might fit, or yeah, so.
So one thing I can offer as an input, when we were doing this under ISO for the stuff that we're doing under work group 10 for IoT, and related technologies was we created a mind map. And it's a huge mind map that we basically documented like everything for 2 years. It's still quite relevant. So what I can do is I can basically donate that to this group as an input, and that'll save you a lot of the research time to basically get us hit the ground running, and then we can take those pieces that we need. It's got a lot of the standards cataloged. It's got like all the sectors. It's got pretty much every single factor of IoT and related systems. And so from that, we can just use that, and that'll get us going. Yeah.
So I want to point out that there are two pieces of information that came from that. The first thing is that we've got a mind map, and the second thing is that FOUD is going to participate in this working group. Okay, I've got here eight items for this label/info working group. I don't know what we're going to call it, but Alice. This working group has got 8 items here, right? We've got this question about whether to develop some sort of specification, whether to use some sort of specification, or whether to collaborate with somebody else who's already making one where it's not done yet. So that's the first thing that I think I heard. And I think that there was a very strong preference for using and collaborating, using even more than collaborating, because people seem to think that there's an awful lot of stuff out there, so we should just use the stuff as much as possible. This one seemed to be like kind of a bad idea unless we had like evidence that there was something really missing. We've got this question about how to interact with the providers of these things, and this seems to be like a key problem, and we figure that this is the person who's going to have it. We've got to identify some tests and develop them if they're needed. You know, testers, mechanisms for it, and so on, ongoing tests. We've got this question about the technical aspects of the label meaning, and I think that this is where in particular, this conceptual map of the standards is going to interact with this thing. Boy, I'm going to hit my head on that. That'll be entertaining for everyone. There's a strong principle to reuse other work, and this technical aspects of the label meaning and the requirements for a label. What does each label mean? Obviously, those are really pretty tightly related topics. Finally, we've got to identify any gaps in order to say, are there things that are missing in here? So that was what I heard. Does that sound like the charter of this working group that's going to develop these labels to say, here are what the label is going to be. This is the content. Was that a yes or no or okay? Okay, so this is one working group that we're going to have, and everybody's in agreement with this. They like this because there's a certain amount of turf here, right? That what's going to happen is we're dividing up the workspace, and we're going to say if somebody comes along with a good idea in awareness or comes along with a good idea in network resiliency, and it's about these topics, we're going to say, no, that should be developed by those people over there. They're already working on it, so that's where you should take it. And the reason for that is not so that we can encourage turf wars, because that's kind of boring. The idea is that we don't want to have competing things developed by 2 different people, and now we've got that aren't talking to one another. So the idea here is that if you have one of these topics, this is the group that you're going to work on with it. Okay, everybody's cool with this? Buffo. All right. The next one. See if I can tear this off without tearing the whole sheet. Oh, you're going to be my easel. Excellent. Ha! I do so remember how paper works. Okay, so our next group had to do with the awareness and education. So this was about awareness and education, and we had different targets for this thing. So one thing that I heard is that this is a group that's going to develop campaigns, communications campaigns for people. Is that a true thing? I can't tell if that's a no or a maybe or an ugh. Okay. No, you absolutely should. This This is a multi-stakeholder thing. I want to know what people think.
Not just, it's not about a campaign, it's about understanding, maybe developing guidelines, maybe some basic roadmaps, maybe some decision-making trees, things to concern with, pointing to the standards. It's essentially maybe a toolkit for cities or perhaps and consumers and or any other kind of large technological system consumer procurement entity, so that they have something that can help them with the decision-making process when it comes to the time to acquire, to use, or to pay attention to, et cetera.
That's not how you spell decision. So I've written here, toolkit for decision-making. Is that a fair summary? That looks like a no.
So is this working group supposed to develop a communications campaign? I'd say no. This is not necessarily a campaign. I see it more in the lines of a program or a larger initiative that has a couple of components. Definitely communications is a part of it. Toolkit, product, services.
Before you go on, communications is a part of it, like actually doing the communicating or preparing
the communication component, the communication plan, the communication. If it's going to do the communication itself, that's another story.
Okay, so you want a communication plan?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm trying to write down items, right? So
yes, and so if what has to be developed, in my view, is a sort of like an umbrella of various elements that include a toolkit, that include products, that include perhaps services that form part of like something that's going to actually be delivered. Like the communications plan, in my view, is how and what are the messages, but there has to be content, products, toolkits, something, and that is to be determined. I just wanted to bring, like at the intellectual property office, and I'm going to throw it right in here. SIPO over the last year, like intellectual property was this like vague thing that nobody knew about, and all of a sudden it became hot. So over the last year, and for different reasons, it's like the IP strategy now brought this in as a core element, but basically over the last year, we've been working on an awareness and education campaign. So there's like webinars and in-person seminars and like online tools and toolkits and ways that you can define what you need and how you need it, like online, and also materials. So it's a combination of in somebody physically that can answer a phone at a call center, somebody that can physically interact with somebody in a library, and also the online tools and the opportunity for you to like scan something and get all the information. So it's not just like now that we're all online, we're gonna just, it has to be like this multi-pronged approach, and there has to be something at the end. So at the end, what is it that you're getting? Is it a manual? Is it a toolkit? Is it a video? A something?
So this working group is going to develop those materials, but not, I assume, answer the phone, right? Well, I am not signing up to answer the phone, by the way. I don't even answer my own phone.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this working group is going to develop the materials, or is it going to develop the outline of what a toolkit or the material should be, and see who is
excellent question. Okay, good.
And who's going to develop is somebody else.
Okay.
But if you define that you need a communication plan and you need a toolkit and this is the characteristics and this is has to focus and this is the audience, that is what I thought this and why,
Okay, so if I could distinguish that, that sounds to me like the distinction between developing the materials and developing the, or what I guess I might say the requirements for what those materials would be. Is that a fair way, a distinction?
Correct.
Okay, so.
They're different skills.
Well, I agree. So what I'm trying to narrow down what the working group's going to do. So who thinks that it's going to develop the materials? Well, let me ask the full question. Okay, and who thinks it's going to develop the requirements for the materials? So some people think both. Some people think only the requirements. Some people don't know what I mean. And then there were a lot of people who didn't respond at all. So I think what I've got is a hand here, and a hand here, and a hand here, and a hand there. Okay, so I think you were first.
Yeah, can we, sorry, this is Taylor Bentley from ISED. Why don't we just apply the same principle from the previous working group, which is use what people are already using? And I think that may help you answer that question, whether or not you're developing content, because the first question would be, are you developing content that someone has already developed?
Right.
As far as a plan, that's, I would imagine, less treaded territory, but there may be gaps in the existing content. My colleague from OCA mentioned the functionality element of, what are typically privacy and security discussions. But even that was already in the Consumers International report. So I would say at some point we need to include the principle of do not duplicate, map things out, identify gaps.
Who else did I have? Let's go across the room. So we were here.
Actually, I was pretty much going to say it.
Oh, okay. Okay. And you were next.
Hussein Badran, I agree 100% that we should look at what already exists and try to tailor it or modify it or add to it. And also we need to identify which category of user groups we are addressing. The comment from a enterprise perspective or a smart city perspective is fine, but we should not forget about the individual user and different categories of different users, at least from an age perspective. The level of understanding, level of information capturing will be different, and the message has to be tailored so that it can be useful. Ultimately, we are focusing on having an impact, and the message needs to be clear and impactful so that we can see some success.
I'm going to write down while you make your remarks. Please go ahead. Oh, I didn't see you too. So let's just do that. No, it's okay. You're fine, and then we'll.
When you summarized this earlier, your comments were that this group needed to figure out specifically who we wanted to target, what types of products we wanted to target, and what kind of messages that we wanted to target. So privacy, security, and we had mentioned functionality. The concept about the smart city is a very different than individual products. So I do think we really need to think about. I mean, there's a huge difference between the consumer angle and the citizen angle. And from the consumer angle, I'm really hoping that we can nail down. There's already a lot of really good information on security tips, privacy tips, checklists and stuff that we could use as a starting point so that we can help consumers say, this is what you need to know, or the questions you should be asking before you buy these products. Then you bring it home. Here are a few things you should know just when you're setting it up. And then something goes wrong. This is where you go for help. That's what you can do to inspire confidence in these products. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want consumers to be confident in using these things. It's good for business. It's good for consumers.
Hi, my name is Franca Palazzo. I went last, so now everyone's said what I but I just want to, I agree with you. And the one piece that I do think is really important is that the comms piece. Because at the end of the day, whatever we come up with, if we don't at least indicate a framework as to all of those, who are we targeting and what the message is, then we're doing it for nothing. At the end of the day, citizens are who we want to help and who need to understand how IoT can affect them.
So I think what I'm hearing, before I turn to Alan, I think what I'm hearing is that we have to identify the audience, the kinds of things that we're going to apply to, which presumably are partly determined by that labeling and info thing before. But there is this problem, of course, that you can't really put a label on a sidewalk. So there's a gap there that that this thing doesn't cover, and we need to identify what kinds of messages need to be sent. That is the requirements for the message, because then we can identify the things that are already prepared and identify any gaps. Is that a fair summary of what I've just heard in this room? Okay, so I've got two things. Alan was first, and
yes, I think you may have already captured it, but I think it's worth saying out loud. I don't envisage this process continuing indefinitely. I don't envisage this group or some derivative of it actually undertaking an education and awareness campaign itself. Rather, it will do the best it can to demonstrate the potential effectiveness and the value in said information and awareness campaign. So to that end, while it may involve, for example, developing sample messages like to illustrate what could be done, I see it more, to use your words, develop the requirements for the messages, to make the case for the value of education and awareness, perhaps look at what other countries have done, for example, and to point at, like you could, magazines or whatever, but not to actually develop the specific campaign itself. That's certainly the way I see this, so I wouldn't see the artwork or whatever. So that's how I'm conceptualizing this myself.
Okay. I think Tracy's next, yeah, and then Walter.
So I agree with that, and for me, a toolkit is all of those things. A toolkit is a gap analysis. You do some research, you have a gap analysis, you point to the resources that you have, you find your target users, et cetera, et cetera. So really, there may be some opportunities to, if there are some gaps that are identified, that maybe something has to be written up, whether it's this group or this group seeks the right forum that does that writing up is something that would have to be considered. But to me, that's what a toolkit is. It's doing all of those kinds of things.
I think, well, oh, sorry. Go ahead, and then we'll come to you. Okay.
Yeah, it's Hossein Badran. Just thinking out loud, I agree that perhaps we should not be the one who's doing the actual artwork, but we see ourselves maybe commissioning that to be done by a third party. I know ISOC has developed lots of tools for similar purposes. Maybe ISOC can take the lead in developing or subcontracting in somebody else. I think it would be very useful to see a final outcome at the end of the process. Doesn't matter who is doing it, but make sure that the messages that we are developing and the requirements we are developing see the end of the tunnel, something concrete that's developed and being shared, at least to gauge success. I mean, how are you going to gauge success with just the requirements in a paper? I don't think it would be enough.
Thanks. I just want to clarify, maybe there's an implicit assumption about who we are educating and making aware. Like, is there an implicit assumption that it's the users of IoT, or does it also include the providers of IoT? So I'm thinking like startups, right? A lot of startups just come up, right? They don't necessarily know the landscape, so there ought to be some kind of communications towards the providers as well in terms of security, et cetera. So is there an implicit assumption here, or is it the breadth of the stakeholders in IoT?
Well, I don't intend it to be implicit. So what I've written here below the toolkit for decision making, I've got this communication plan. So message requirements, we've got to identify the audience, identify kinds of things to talk about, identify the content already out there. And so then that would fall under this identify the audience.
Right,
What
so
kind of audience do you
instead
need?
of just users.
Yes.
Thanks.
And then finally, I've got this item on here, do not develop the campaigns as such. This is the point that I think Alan just made very strongly, but I think many people seem to agree with that, and that seems reasonable to me because, people have it's somebody else apart from the working group who's going to do this. That doesn't mean that somebody else doesn't get commissioned to do it or whatever. And then finally, we had this idea that I haven't mentioned so far on here of identifying things that haven't been done yet, right? This is the gap identification. Okay, so those are 4 things that I've heard so far. And I guess implicit on here, maybe instead of this being a thing that we write on each one, we should have this general principle, just reuse stuff as much as possible. So reuse things that, right, the not invented here syndrome is toxic, and we shouldn't embrace it. So is that a fair summary of what we've heard so far? Okay, so I can put this up, but I mean, we have more paper. I've got only 4 things on here, and it surprises me that this is the one that people had the most to say. This education and awareness group was the one that people seemed to have the most to say about in the time before the break, and yet we have half as much stuff up there that we're going to do as on the first one, at least because that's the way I've written the numbers. Can you read again? I can. So the first thing was this idea of a toolkit for decision making, and then as we broke that out, we said, okay, we've got a kind of communication plan that we need to develop. So we develop the requirements for a message, we identify the audience, we identify the kinds of things that we're talking about. So right, we've got, you know, like your thermostat in your house and the sidewalk of sidewalk labs. Those are different kinds of things, I think, and they need different kinds of messages, different requirements for them. We're going to identify the content that's already out there, the point that you've made quite eloquently. So this is the sort of plan that we're going to have. Then we've got a general requirement not to develop campaigns as such, and we got to identify gaps. But I can see that you're dissatisfied, so use the mic, please.
No, because I'm not. I also had mentioned like to define, and that's where we got to the not develop but to define.
Okay.
I call it products and services. Like when you talk about the communication campaign, for me it's more like the plan of the messaging and so on and so forth. But in what I'm thinking that, because here you have the toolkit for decision making, and I'm not really sure I understand exactly what you mean by that.
Well, I don't mean it. I think it was Tracy, so maybe
okay,
she can
so
say
Tracy
more about
can
that.
expand. But in the communication plan, and when you mention all the things there, I would want to add products and services to do the awareness and education. Like, I mean, is it going to be a video? Is it going to be a, sorry, not that we develop delivery mechanisms. I call it product service delivery mechanism. Is it, does the group propose that there's online videos of blah, blah, blah of these items? Or
okay,
as somebody was mentioning there, a video of when you receive a product, you do, what is it? To think about that. Is it going to be an online 40-page document? Is it going to be whatever? So that, I call it products and services. What did you call it? Delivery mechanism. It's is the both. No. I'm talking about no. It's the thing and how. You're talking about the how. I'm talking about the thing. Suppose it's a video online. That's what I'm saying. I don't know, but I think we have to think about that.
Okay.
So.
Right, that's a campaign, and we just said no to campaign.
No, we're not doing it. We in the communications plan that you mentioned. For me, and what I understand, a communications plan is, okay, this is going to be the messaging, this is going to be the audience for this.
Right.
I did not know if the what and the how is captured. If you tell me that after that definition of that plan, of the communication plan, we propose that there's educational videos that are distributed, blah, 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 and that's captured there, not that we're going to do it?
I think it's not, so I think I heard some other people who are objecting to that, so why don't we hear some more from that? So I think, Tracy, because also there was a question for you, so you get a double bang and then you.
Woohoo! All right, so early on, prior to getting to the sheet, we had said something like consumer, public sector procurement and deployment in public space kind of guideline decision-making toolkit. So that's what that is, and we'd have to, as a group, develop the charter that's related to that. We said that we would not have a communications campaign, but you're suggesting maybe requirements for things that could be useful for communication, but not develop the communication campaign. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. So we got that sorted out. That's it, I think.
Thanks. And all I was reflecting on was the fact that we had said develop the requirements, not the campaign. And to me, the products and services are the pieces of the campaign. So that, we just have to come to a decision. Are we actually designing this? Or, as it was mentioned, do we provide the requirements and then the people who would know how to deliver it, maybe ISOC, as an example, would put the specifics into the plan? We just have to decide.
Okay, so I've got Timur and then Kim. Oh, okay.
Whatever is the way of writing the idea, in my mind, a communication plan, if the working group is doing the requirements and we decide that for a certain age group there could be a video, it doesn't mean that what I'm saying is that we don't have to develop the video. We just have to say that we've identified that, for example, for this age group or for this element, these could be the possible, and we could define, and it could be online, it should be in person, it should be, we think that there should be a course at the library. It doesn't mean that we have to define the course, and it doesn't mean we have to deliver it, but that's what I'm saying in that, I don't know if it's captured already, but just to identify these types of things, as we look at the matrix of age and things and elements. Audience, the elements, whatever.
Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, you were 4.
I'm just gonna pick up on what Kim was saying. I don't really know how to frame it because it's the terminology of, again, to me also of products and services is just has a different connotation, and I know that's probably just from where I come from. But like the idea of like doing that, like what is the, are there some ideal types of mechanisms like school educational, like lesson plans or something like that? Or do we not think that lessons plans are going to be useful because, like, doing that type of analysis of like what types of communication service mechanisms would best address specific types of information gaps that we identify might be useful. Whereas I was thinking initially that the communication plan was more of a meta thing, and maybe I just misunderstood this, but it was more like, does there need to be a helpline somewhere that responds to, not are we going to make a helpline, but does there need, and maybe I'm actually like, maybe they're really the same thing, I don't know, and not two separate things.
So I think to answer that, I think very clearly the agreement so far has been that this working group is not going to set up a helpline. But this working group might identify helpline needed.
Yes.
I think that's
what we want. The requirements of a communication plan, not the actualization,
yes.
Production of the products of the communication. Thanks for products. Yes.
Okay.
I don't know what we mean. We call them products and services.
Okay.
But I mean, what we mean, for example, a product.
Okay, we're going to come back to you because you don't have the mic. It's like the talking stick.
Sorry. I'm going to also cheat, and my other one was, but I'm wondering though, whether for the toolkit itself, and I know we shouldn't be, there might be information already to cultivate, I don't want to say make or develop or create, cultivate a toolkit or something like that, or like if we get into it and we find that most of the information to create a toolkit is there with a little bit of extra stuff and people are willing to put work into that, I feel like we should, it might be worth leaving that. Whereas we all agree that we can't create a helpline and we don't, unless some of us have hidden acting talents, we don't want to make videos. That might be something that might be worth leaving, or at least thinking about whether it's worth like something that we can contribute to as an output as well. And it'll come down to what is actually out there already. Like if there's enough out there that we can just add a little bit to it.
So I have you, then Pam, then, no? Oh, okay.
Hi, it's Pam Miller from ISED. Just to say, I think we'd like to see something that could be implemented at the end of the process. So I think having it too high level that simply we should or could do this is not enough, that it has to be something tangible enough that it could be implemented. So we wouldn't be the group that would be implementing, but you could pass it off to recommendations to ISOC, to any one of the multi-stakeholder groups in this room, to universities, to ISED, but with clear enough guidance that it's something that could be implemented, whether that's key messages or guidelines or a segmentation of who should be targeted, but tangible and concrete enough that we could actually action the outcome.
Okay, now hang on while I get the cue. You're next, definitely. And then I had Alan, and I had you, and then I have you and you. Did I catch everybody? Okay, good.
I actually was going to say pretty much the same thing. My concern is that at the end of the day, I think we want to raise the bar, and if we're not actually, if we're developing a plan that isn't implemented, or we don't have a partner to deliver on it, then at the end of the day, we'll have a wonderful plan, but we won't meet any objective. And our objective is raising the bar for consumers to make better decisions, and that can't be done unless it's implemented. So we need to make sure we have that mechanism to implement it if we're not doing it ourselves.
Okay. Yes, Alan was next.
Yes, it's Alan McGilvery. So just a couple of short comments. I'm concerned that communications plan has overtaken the notion of education and awareness. They're not the same thing. And so I certainly accept that there would be a plan. But like here's an example. Training for frontline retail staff in electronic stores. Now that's not in a communications plan, but that I think is something that certainly would want to be considered. So I think you have to clearly, there are really, as someone said, delivery mechanism. In box one is the message, right? Labeled product, good. Unlabeled product, bad, okay? And all of the stuff around that. Then in the next box is how do we get those messages out directly or indirectly to the consumer to allow an informed decision. So so maybe there's research somewhere that says people who buy webcams never read newspapers. So then you don't suggest using newspaper ads to inform and educate or something like that. But in other words, you provide some guidance on getting the message out, but you're not saying, yes, we should do a quarter-page ad buy in the Globe and Mail every quarter, and, right? So that's way down the road. But to the extent you can help whoever is going to implement this deal with that, I think that would be useful. Thank you.
Okay. And Rob is next.
I just want to agree with Alan on that. And to this, it really does come down to, as Taylor was mentioning, the delivery mechanism is one aspect of it, and it can be articulated in the plan as well. But we just have to decide, is it going to be an end deliverable, or is it a set of requirements? And having this discussion, we're probably never going to get to the actual working groups. So that's what I think. Some of these things could be handled within the working group itself, so that we can cross-educate each other.
Strongly agree with that. Okay, so we come over here, you're next, and then back across the back. So then I've got you and you.
Hi, so I just have a question. I would like some clarification. When you say toolkit for decision making, so being one of the organizations that would hope to actually implement at the end of this, I would like to see that toolkit mean the kind of content that I can draw on to then develop the campaigns. Is that correct? Perfect.
Okay. So you're next anyway.
Yes, yes, and yes. So it's a toolkit. The toolkit could contain a decision tree. It could contain a fact sheet. It could, we don't know what it will contain. It will be targeted at different users, the consumer, the city, and different individual age groups that were brought up earlier that would be decided at the working group level. And then the scan of existing material, from the scan of existing material, that is what would go actually, those actual objects would go into the toolkit, they'd be described, et cetera, and or what they talk about would be discussed. The gaps that would be identified, the things that we haven't seen in this kind of material, this is where new material may have to be prepared. And then how the different products are created would be recommendations and perhaps requirements of the group. But the toolkit could be many different things, and I really do think it really should be at the working group level that that's figured out. And often you can't figure those things out until you've done a scan of what actually exists. So I would say that maybe instead of kind of trying to finalize what that thing is, because you used the word toolkit early on to kind of go through the list of all the things I'd said earlier. We can stick with that and figure it out at the working group level, I think.
Okay. And you're next. And have I missed anybody? Oh, okay.
So if the toolkit is then what's going to contain what I call products and services, then perhaps we have to put a toolkit for decision making, but also what the toolkit is at the core of the identification of the awareness and education pieces. I agree with Alan in the sense, like, I just want to identify that in our jargon at SIPO, a service is a call center, like somebody that will provide a service. That's a service. Somebody that does one-on-one consultations that you can book a meeting with is a service. A product is a one-pager. And what I think the working group is, for example, is there a requirement to demystify the security threat of the toaster that's connected to the internet? So that's an item that will require the development of a one-pager that can be available at the libraries, and there could be a one, we could, what I see is there's an identification that there's an opportunity for a 1-minute video or a 10-second video, like whiteboard video, to show how to turn off or turn on whatever. So what I call products and services, they call them things or elements or content. Perhaps it's in the toolkit that can be actually, I want to, if you want to call it toolkit, that's fine, but it's more like what are the products and services that will support awareness and education.
So what I've identified here, because I think that this came out of the previous discussion, I've tried to write this in a way that will cut across the dialects of people. I've written, identify good mechanisms for the message, and I put in parentheses products and services to identify that as the same thing. Does that capture what we're talking about?
Yes, it does, but just to take a clarification, the content, like the pieces, the products, is one thing, and the mechanisms of delivery is another part of it. So, for example, the one-pager, is it online or is it at the library? Is the education, for example, is the education on something going to be in a webinar? Is it a seminar? Is it something that the call center is going to deliver? It doesn't matter. It's to be defined, but it's products, services, and mechanisms of delivery.
Okay. And here.
Chris Parsons. This is probably implicit in much of this, but and maybe it belongs or doesn't. But in the work that we do at the lab, where we do build out projects where other people can just pick them up and walk with them and take them wherever they want to take them around the world, one of the things that we have found very helpful in building out these sort of guidelines is the resources required for discrete elements. So I'm picturing it's a multi-stakeholder environment. Some people might be able to implement pieces and not others. And so when people are building out, the toolkits or, however this looks, just to envision what kind of resources are required. Maybe a small NGO can do a one-pager or a webinar, but the federal government of Canada is required to run a call center or something like that. Just to make it a little bit more actionable for the parties that might actually be picking this up and be motivated to do it. So they're not doing their own resource evaluations, and they can pick up what's already there.
So I've written that down as identify resources needed for each item. Is that fair? Okay. And I didn't miss, by the way, the actionable thing up here. I wrote that down. Okay, so look at that. We got to 7. Fair enough. This could be many items underneath it. So now what we've got is this toolkit for decision making. We seem to have spent a lot of time sort of expanding what toolkit means. Maybe I shouldn't have used that word in the first place. And this includes some sort of communication plan, and that includes this message requirements. We've got to identify the audience, the identification of the kinds of things we're going to talk about. That is the appropriate message for the appropriate kind of thing that we're talking about. And we've got to identify the stuff that's already available. So the things that people have already made, and maybe put that all up together so that you can do that. We've got this principle that shouldn't develop the campaigns as such. And I still hear people hanging on to that, so I feel comfortable with it. Obviously, we want to identify gaps. And that sort of necessarily follows really from all of this, right? This is kind of an entailment more than anything else. We have this idea of identifying the mechanisms that the various kinds of messages ought to have. So this is the products and services identification part. You don't build them, but you identify what they are. Whatever this is, it's got to be actionable. So somebody needs to be able to pick this up and take it away at the end of this and be able to go and run with it so that it's a useful thing. You don't want to spend a lot of time. And this is, by the way, this is a super important point for multi-stakeholder things in general, right? Whenever you're trying to do this, you better have something that people feel like they're working on something that's going to result in something. I will say personally that this is because my boss will fire me if I don't actually do something that they can point to later. And finally, there's this idea that you should identify what it takes to deliver any kind of item so that people trying to pick this thing up can know, oh, I could do that one, or that one requires the resources of a nation state, or the resources of a small dark star, or whatever. Well, some of the proposals that people make about the Internet of Things, right? Okay, we're going to boil this ocean and all of the possible oceans on Jupiter. And it seems like that's an important thing to understand. Okay, are there any other things that we think that this education and awareness group ought to be working on? Have I missed anything that people have said? Yes?
It's Alan. I think you should have the messages as a separate bullet. Okay.
I mean, we're going to rewrite this, right? This is not the form in which the charters are going to be put up because sticky notes at wall size, not good for the internet. But I will make that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to underline this message requirements here so that it's clear that that's a sort of high-level primary thing. How's that? Okay, this is the emergent charter of another working group that you're going to be on the hook to sign up for. Remember, locking the doors, passing the clipboard around. How am I doing on time?
25 minutes.
I got 25 minutes to talk about the network resiliency piece. So this was the third working group that we talked about, and this is about how to make devices resilient in the face of the network and how to make the network resilient in the face of the devices. At least I think it's both. Not everybody agrees with me. That may be the first point of contention. So, do people agree that it needs to go both ways, or do they think that those are just different topics with different people on them? So I gave you a so you know that a disjunction is true just in case only one of the items. So you think that actually both ways is in?
You need to protect the IoT device from the network, and you need to protect the network from IoT device.
Okay,
Yes.
good. So what is this working group going to do about that?
I think one thing to make clear is the difference between the standards piece and the resilience piece. I see the standards as kind of setting our baseline, our floor, if you will, and the resilience piece setting out the best practices or the ceiling. So let's identify concrete set of recommendations for like the best of the best system.
So you're arguing that this is a if I put my propeller hat on, this is recommendations for operations and management, and it's not standard setting.
Correct.
Yep.
We made one. So.
Good. I've got two people here, so that's good. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think ultimately we want to make sure there are standards that address this.
Okay.
So we'd be doing requirements, we'd be doing inputs to that standards process, we'd be looking for partners, at least in my opinion, and gaps. Thank you.
And in relation to that, I would just add that I think the goal for me on this would just to create like a white paper that basically takes all of that collective thoughts and then just puts it out there on, the two topics, then what are the guidance for doing it. I think that's more than anything what the industry needs. And I have just a side question. I'm going to throw a curveball at everybody. So we've got all these different groups working in silos. The one thing I can see as possibly being a problem is there's a lot of carryover between the different groups. How do we ensure that the group 1 is talking to group 2, making sure that there's cross collaboration, talking to work group 3 to make sure the communication pieces or the awareness pieces are there, just as a process piece, completely separate to what you're doing right now? How do we ensure that there's that continuity of messaging and stuff, and everyone's staying on the same topic and the same message? That would be a concern of mine.
So to answer that question, that's the multi part of multi-stakeholder. And what that often means is multi-groups. So one way that this happens in practice is that you've got somebody who's interested in two topics and they're paying attention to both. And then when a topic comes up in one place and it impinges on something that's going on in the other place, that person has the responsibility to say, those other people are going in completely the other direction, and we ought to spend some time working with them. The problem with the internet, right, is that there are no police. The good thing of the internet is that there are no internet police, and the bad thing about the internet is that there are no internet police. And the reason that that's a good and bad thing is because it allows this sort of flexible use, the smarts are at the end and everything like that. But the problem, of course, is that, this kind of problem can frequently have giant gaps and people do everything in the wrong way and so on. So what we have to do is we've got to have people who are participating across these sorts of things. We've got to make sure that some people, at least, are paying attention to at least two groups, right? So you've got intersections across the whole space. If you don't have intersections across the whole space, then I completely agree with you. But I am not in charge, so I can't make anybody do this. That's one of the constant problems here. So while the mic is coming over, I'll just say what I've written down so far is we've got this goal: protect the net from things and protect the things from the net. Then we've got 2, that this is operations and management guidance, and 3, that it's got to identify requirements for standards but not make standards. So far, that's what I think I've heard. Go ahead.
Just a suggestion, short of having people participate in more than one group, each group could identify 2 liaisons that could then meet, 2 very dedicated people who could then meet to share a report on what their group's working on. And then you don't have to worry, because that way they're getting information from all 3 groups as opposed to 2.
Right. And different bodies do these things different ways. Sometimes people rely on it being casual. Sometimes people rely on it being explicit. It's somebody's job to do this. One difficulty that we have in the multi-stakeholder world is that, right, everybody is strictly speaking a volunteer. It's very hard to compel volunteers to do their job. Try firing a volunteer, for instance. That's a fun day. So that can be one of the difficulties. And I think that that's something that the working groups are going to have to work out amongst themselves. I think some of these things, right, I think it's pretty obvious that the network resilience people may be, there's going to be some overlap between that and the people who want to make labels, because they're going to be people who are working in both things, right? People who are suppliers or something like that. I'm a little more worried about this working group and, say, the education and awareness one. Okay. Go ahead.
So another thing we're talking about, in addition to the white paper, would be building prototype of what we want and running code. So to have actual IoT devices that are safe from the internet and they're protected from the internet, and to show how labels would work, how QR code would work, and making the instead of just having a instead of talking, if we're going to raise awareness and education, we should have the real thing that we can actually test it on before, and then say this is how it should work.
So this is interesting. We've now got geeks at war. One group of people want to build a prototype. They want to build a proof of concept, and other people think that we're just producing guidance. So this is the way we do this among engineers. Who's willing to donate code to this? Okay, we've got people willing to donate code. Excellent. That's what we're doing now, folks. Once people are willing to donate code, running code wins. So, so if we actually get code, the code is what's going to happen. And I think that that's marvelous. I saw 4 different hands at least go up. That's an amazing story. I know that doesn't sound like very many but actually that's a fantastic sign. That tells me actually people are devoted to working on this and are going to work on ways to show that it actually operates. That's A+. So I'm going to put on here, I'm going to put on this charter proof of concept code, all right? Yes. Oh, we need a mic. And I'm out of paper. Well, maybe I don't need it yet.
Thank you very much. So Sam Badran, I think one thing we're missing in the information of our group is the service provider side. Last meeting we had at least one of them in the room. I think it would be critical to have a service provider in the discussion to complement our point of view as user or our architects of the network. Actually, a service provider who builds the network and runs and operates it. So what we're recommending is actually has some acceptance from an operator point of view.
So I think we have at least one. Yeah.
Oh, you are from. Yeah. Okay, you're here. Okay. I wasn't sure.
But does that mean that we should identify participants for this, or? So this is an interesting point, actually, that we have not identified who the necessary participants are in any of these yet. But this is actually an interesting point, right? That one problem that you can have in the multi-stakeholder world is that one of the critical stakeholders doesn't show up, and then you do all this work, and then it turns out that when you go and talk to them, they say, "Well, we're not doing any of that." Because, right, like most volunteer things, right, when somebody's not at the meeting, they get all the work. So that can be a problem. So maybe what we need to do, actually, is identify for all of these who needs to be there. Yes. Okay. So are there other things that this resilience thing has to do? Right now, I've got 2 goals. We've got to protect the net from the things, and we've got to protect the things from the net. And we're going to do that by producing operations and management guidance rather than standards. But got to identify requirements for standards. So if there are gaps in the standards, we can say to the various standards development organizations, "Hey, SDOs, we don't care which of you has the talking stick here, but somebody's got to build this standard." And then finally, this is a group that's actually going to produce proof of concept code as well as recommendations. So that's all I've got for it right now. Is that is that the complete story for this working group? The charter, anyway. Obviously, the work has to be done.
But do you want a communications plan? He said he was going to feed into the awareness and education to raise awareness.
Well, that's a point though.
You haven't got the talking stick, Sean. I just think, I happen to know what Jacques is talking about, but I feel that when one person's network is not the same as another person's network, I've got 3 laptops, a printer, and a router at home, and that's a network.
Yep.
And there are 65,000 ASs in the world, and that's another network. So I think we better make sure that we're all talking network on the same scale.
Well, I think I would offer a friendly amendment to that. That is, we better be talking about networks on different scales because they've got different kinds of problems. Okay? So I've got 2 people in the queue.
Going to mention that Jack also mentioned that they were going to provide input to the awareness and education to increase the awareness and education on these things that they're going to be looking into. They can develop the content for the pieces.
Jacques is saying, no, I'm not developing any content. But you wanted the talking stick. Go ahead.
What I said is we can be consulted, or our input can be provided to, our output can be used to feed your input to build the content. Absolutely. But no, we're not building training programs and stuff.
Okay.
Super naive question. Where are the people?
Where are the people?
There's an IoT and a network, but where are the people? You've talked about things, you've not talked about people in there. Like, you're doing this for the purpose of not just the network and not just the things, but also things for people, no? Again, it's a naive question on my part. So
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment to that as well, just to disambiguate the whole topic. Just put down network resilience, and that restricts it to network facing and device network functionality, as opposed to the external world where the people are involved. I assume that's what it is.
So that's, this is a nice ambiguity in here, isn't it? Go ahead. Well, I'm trying to send the stick towards you. It's like a current flowing.
Having been in the standards process for 6 years, trying to define this, it's implicit, right? Because IoT is cyber-physical. And so it's almost implicit that there's a potential human or a dog or whatever attached to this thing in some way, shape, or form, or can interact with it. And so you can't necessarily, you have to really pull back, and you have to look at, IoT is so different in so many ways because of, you could be here, but it's a component that's on the other side of the planet, but yet you're the human who's touching it here. So it's implicit. And that's what we had to learn to think about when we were looking at IoT, is it does have all of these groupings that need to be considered, and you can't just put it into groups, because if you try to do that and you try to break it out, you're just going to lose your mind. I swear to God. Like, we've been down that road, and you can argue that one for days and days, and we have in multiple IoT group meetings in ISO and IEC. So I just want to save us that effort, okay? It's implicit that those things are there. I think when I share our mind map that we came up with, a lot of that stuff you'll go, oh yeah, oh yeah. And then you understand conceptually just how big this thing is, because it's big. And then you start to say, okay, now you can start to conceptually understand the elements you need to consider when we're working through this. And I think once you see that, it makes sense to some of the stuff we're focusing on. We're not going to try to boil the ocean. I think by focusing on these 3 areas, we focus on the stuff that I think that it's important to, I think, our group, and then also what's important to Canadians, both consumers and business, and that's it. Like, and that's all we do for this point. And I think that'll keep us quite busy for the next couple of years. and then, you know, we figure out what's next. So let's not try to boil the ocean. I would say keep it simple, right? Understand just how big this is and the concepts that are included when we say IoT, and don't try to just break everything out, because if you do, it'll just get ugly and just deter the group from really what we need to focus on.
So can I try to pull a thread out of this, which is, it sounds to me like there is a thing that needs to happen here from this working group, and that is this clear meaning of what resilience means for these purposes, right? And we can pull that to a certain extent, I think, out of this mind map. But we need to make sure that the working group is clear about what it means when it says we're going to be resilient, we're going to protect this device from the network or so on. And so you're next because you had a comment first.
On the user part, I think the education awareness is covering a lot of what the user is expecting and should be expected from network, on his behavior part as well. So I think we are covered, should be covered there without complicating things too much, and I agree with Fuad that complicating too much will not be beneficial. Okay. Hopefully, sometime we'd like to see the gaps that we have in the groups in terms of presence of stakeholders, who should be targeting to just make sure that we have the full picture of what we're trying to address.
Right. Okay, so Fuad next, and then Tracy.
Thank you. So the other point I would probably make clear is, if you look at just where ISO and IEC and just a lot of groups are, even IEEE, resilience is a component of what's called trustworthiness, right? So then the question is, are we just breaking out resilience, or are we going to start talking about trustworthiness? Because trustworthiness is security, it's privacy, it's resilience, it's a whole bunch of availability, there's a whole bunch of other aspects. So that's the kind of stuff I'm worried about, because I'd rather, if we're going to talk about resilience, do we talk about network trustworthiness? Because that's really what, if you look at everywhere else, that's what they're talking about. They've basically grouped all of those things into that one topic.
So I think that this group was intended to be restricted, but I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say. I think you were next.
So when I said people, it wasn't to add complicate, it was really for me to conceptually understand. So really, it really was a question of concept. But I guess the follow-up from that is that, and your response is completely fine, because again, I'm naive in that particular component of things. But then where does agency come in, right? So who has responsibility for what? So, or which organization or which institution, and who oversees and who pays attention to resiliency, who manages trust, and who's a trusted agent in this space? I guess it's more, when I'm thinking of the people part, I'm thinking of that. Because it's not just a device to a network, there's people that intervene along the way. I didn't necessarily mean user, but it's that agency piece, that responsibility piece, that authoritative piece related to it. And if it's, what I'm suggesting makes no sense in the context of this, then we can stop the conversation here. But if there is something that makes sense, or if there's something I need to understand, we can either do it offline or address it here. I don't want to complicate it and belabor it, is what I'm saying.
So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that, first of all, was why I thought this was limited to resilience, because we were trying to contain it so that it didn't turn into the trustworthiness problem. But the second thing that I would say is, we've got 5 minutes left in this section, and we do want to get to that thing of who needs to be involved in these things. So the thing that I would say in response to this piece of this discussion is that the least formed of the proto charters that we have here, I think, is this working group. Because I think that this working group is going to have to decide whether it wants to be narrow and focused on the small set of things that we've just listed, which I think is a fine thing to do. A narrow working group that achieves something is an achievement, after all. Or whether it wants to expand its topic and probably its lifetime. So that's something that I think the working group needs to sort out. So, all the way over here, does it fit? Yes. for this network resilience thing, we've got these goals. We're going to protect the network from the things, and we're going to protect the things from the network. So it's a strict resilience thing, and I take the point about trustworthiness being a larger topic into which this plays, but this is this narrow topic. We said that we're going to produce operations and management guidance rather than standards, but we're going to identify gaps in the standards so that, you know, if there are things that need to be developed, we send that off to standards developed organizations. People committed to providing proof of concept code, that's A+. We're going to need to narrow this down so that we make sure that resilience doesn't expand to take on all of trustworthiness, and make sure that we keep that topic nice and tight so that people understand what it is, so that the education and awareness working group, for instance, can take this and understand what the boundaries and limitations are of the recommendations that come from here. And once again, I just put here, you know, for the usual thing, you want to use as much as possible other people's work. Now, we said that we had to identify key stakeholders that need to appear in each one of these things. So, who needs to be in this labeling group first? Who do we need there? Nobody knows? Who here wants to participate in this labeling thing? I'm not taking your names yet, so. Okay, so that gives us some sectors who need to be there, right? Because those are some stakeholders who think they need to be there. Really, nobody's going to tell me. So I think, look, if this is a labeling thing, we've definitely got to have people who know what the things are, right? We need to know the people who know what the things are. They need to know what they're making. So either they've got to be providers of these things, or people who are working in the area, or vendors of them, or something like that, right? That's one group of people who need to be there. Okay? Yep.
Nope. Yeah, I'll let Tom. Oh, sorry. Someone who's familiar with the standards making process and has been kind of tracking, like, so this is not a technical thing, but more of a like a meta thing, like what's happening in some of the other bodies, because even just starting to dig into that can sometimes take a while for people who are not generally familiar. Okay. And I think also someone from the consumer perspective to make, you know, to provide that as well, even though that's probably more something that's primarily in the education, but also someone with a consumer perspective would be helpful here as well.
Okay, hand the mic backwards. Sorry.
Probably the IoT alliances.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is that we need IoT alliances, which is going to include right, people who are making these things and people who are selling them and so on. We need people who are familiar with the standards development work in this area, and we need some people who understand what consumer needs are. That is, what are the consumer sectors of this stuff, or what are the user sectors, the people who are influenced by it. One of the things that's interesting to me is that what didn't come up here are the citizens. That is, the citizens groups who can identify stuff that is going to affect you. Because there's a whole problem here about this labeling and info, right? We said labeling, we spent a lot of time talking about, oh, is it a blue label or a green label or whatever, but you can't do that with a sidewalk or a light pole, but you're still going to have some kind of information, because this, remember, was supposed to be the content that is supposed to be combined with the plan that we're going to have in the other thing. So somebody's going to have something to say about that. So I think that there is some sort of citizen interest group or something like that that needs to be involved here, right? Yeah, humans, right? I think most of the people who would volunteer would be humans, but I mean, then there are the geeks. So, yep.
Trusted certification bodies.
So you want certification bodies. So these are.
The labels and certification, I would imagine they would be related, but
So you need basically you need basically standards. Well, so industry standards organizations, right? Okay. Anything else needs to go here? I know we're over time, but we're going to have to. We got to plow through this bit.
No
All right, so for the education and awareness, I think pretty obviously we've got, right, the people who are representing those who need the education to them. And we need the people who are going to produce messages. Who else?
I would like to see somebody from actually the education system itself, Ministry of Education or Education Board, somebody who's responsible for delivering education curricula to students, that we can get guidance with his expertise, what would be the right tools to use. He can also influence tailoring the messages themselves. I think that would be useful.
Okay. So educators as such, like the formal educator people.
Civil society groups, consumer groups, partners,
Sorry, Kim. I'm thinking citizens groups, civil society groups that might be other consumer groups, and identifying partners that will be the ones that will be delivering the awareness and education.
So do you need them to be participating in the development of this, or do you need to do that as part of the work?
Depends, depending on the partner. It could be a municipal, it could be government, it could be industry. I'm not sure yet, but there has to be the partners, at least key stakeholders that will be delivering or assisting in the delivering.
Okay. Did I see your hand or not? Okay, so I've got here and here. Okay.
Thank you, Rubal Fatah from ISED. I think since we are also looking at certain groups, that there should be some, for example, youth groups, senior groups, perhaps newcomer groups, those that are affected by the most, perhaps negatively, or that are the most vulnerable of the usage of IoT, rural community groups, so kind of a test group of these kind of different subgroups within it.
So I think a critical point in what you're making is that it's not enough to say the people who are affected. You've actually got subgroups within that, and you need to identify particularly outliers within that, because otherwise, very civil society groups, for instance, can represent the mainstream thing, and you want to make sure that the people at the margins of all of those things are included as well. Is that fair?
Precisely, yeah.
Okay.
Well, we certainly need people to do research and to analyze this stuff, so there's no question about that. The stakeholders, so in my case, I'd be very interested in seeing cities involved. I'd be very interested in seeing procurement officers involved, because they would be key users of some of the output of some of these, at least on the aggregation side of it, but also things like Citizen Lab and others who can help us unpack some of the larger implications of aggregate aspects of these tools, from surveillance to policing, mission creep, and all of those other kinds of things that tend to go on the wayside of these discussions.
Okay. Oh, one more? Two more.
And civic, of course.
That's not what people with communications experience.
Okay.
Sorry, just because.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, no, next to you.
Justin Anstett, TBS. Something that might be interesting is trying to track this through some sort of metrics or polling. There was interesting polling done recently on how people think of AI, whether they want government services delivered through artificial intelligence and how comfortable they would be with that, and it's shockingly low, even though people talk regularly to chatbots or something like that and don't really think about it. So some way to kind of measure how public is thinking around these things.
Okay. Okay, so before we move on to the final one, which has bigger gaps in it, I just want to point out the reason we have been laying this out is because all of you who are going to be signing up for this, you're going to need to be identifying these gaps within your working groups, because you're going to have to beat the bushes. I don't know all of these people. I'm a geek. They keep me far away from humans. All right, our final thing was this network resilience, and I think that it's pretty clear that we need network operators involved in that. And it seems pretty obvious that we need sort of manufacturing type people, people who are making these devices or selling them or whatever, because remember, we're going to protect the devices from the network too. Who else needs to be there? The coders. We said that we're going to get code, so we need coders involved. That it? This is what's interesting in a room of policy people. If you ask, well, here's a technical topic. Who do you need? Oh, it's the techies. It's fun because that's actually the experience that we have the other direction too, right? If you walk into a room full of propeller heads and you say, well, what? Oh, it's all public policy people. They make any of the distinctions. So I think that this is an area where I would urge people to reflect a little bit harder on who all needs to be there. So, oh, okay, really good. So we need the standards development organizations. We need to make sure that that perspective is included there because, right, it's supposed to be generating requirements for SDOs. If the SDOs say that ain't a standard, it's not going to be a very useful requirement. Okay, that is our stuff. And what we've got now is the clipboard passing about. So, how you laid this out?
Name, affiliation, email.
So we've got names and affiliations and emails on here. And at the top of the page, there's labeling, network resilience, and education and awareness. So show you, see at the top of the page it says which topic it is. Here it is. And then your name, your affiliation, and your email. Very easy. We're going to pass this around, and people can sign up. You've all got pens. Do we want to separate them? So, oh, there's an idea. We can separate them into 3. Right, then we can circulate them independently. I'll start one here. Oh, right. This is parallel processing in action. And if you get one that you don't want, don't sign on to that one, because we're going to sign you up for a working group. This means that you will be getting email. I'm already on all the lists, I'm afraid. Now, while we are circulating that, while people are signing up for it, I want to ask whether there are other kinds of things that we ought to be doing in order to communicate with one another. Because one of the things I have noticed is that the mailing list traffic is pretty much non-existent. And I come from a world where if you stand up a mailing list, immediately you get like 400 messages, and it's about like what the headers should be. And so that's not maybe that's not this environment. But the problem that we're having is that we need to do the work. And this kind of writing stuff down is not going to happen ideally in a meeting, right? Because it's hard to write in a meeting. It's easy to write among colleagues on a list. So I guess I'm asking, do people want to do they want other kinds of platforms? There's been a proposal to take some of this discussion to LinkedIn. That's one proposal that people have had. I had maybe a different reaction to that proposal, but I'm very happy to hear what people have to think about this.
Yeah, just to reiterate what I said earlier, consider using Slack for this and have different channels for the different working groups and such.
So Slack is a proposal. Slack, for those of you who are not familiar with Slack, is an online collaboration tool. It's very popular among people who like to talk online. It has privacy properties that some people don't like, but other people are comfortable with. So people would have to make up their minds about whether they're willing to join that. These don't have to be mutually exclusive options, right? We don't have to have one tool, but that's a proposal. I don't know if people like Slack. I don't know if people have had a lot of experience with it. Some people don't know it. We can think about that, so that's a proposal. So, so you'd like to have regular conference calls. You want to have check-ins regularly. Katie's got a thing?
Yeah, to that end, we're starting to hold monthly regular webinars, and would encourage you to join those, and we'll send out more information about them on each of the lists.
So that remote people can hear that, there are going to be more regular webinars. ISOC is planning to hold them more regularly, so there'll be more updates coming on the mailing list about that.
Do you guys have any infrastructure where we can co-share documents, drop stuff, blah, 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 that kind of thing? Or are we going to use all our own kind of Dropboxes, et cetera?
So the shared infrastructure for that kind of thing. This is something that ISOC would be able to say more clearly than I would.
I was going to say, there should be, like, not yet, maybe, but reporting out mechanisms for the groups that are periodic so that if the group can see what others
Okay.
share, we want to set up.
Regarding the question about is there, can ISOC provide some services to share documents? Yeah, we have a number of services we use from Box on down to, we're big users of Slack, and you can have documents posted to Slack, and so it is an interesting tool, but it doesn't have to be the tool we use.
So the Mark said that ISOC has multiple services of this. There's Box, there's Slack. There is a Slack service there. You can post documents in Slack. So there's maybe more than one that we can do. And this sounds to me like, I think the point that you're making, though, is that this sounds like a set of services that are probably needed to get this working well. And then there was another thing while that was going on, which was maybe what we need are some formal reporting mechanisms from the various working groups. So that seems like something that the working groups need to figure out how they're going to deliver that, and we can try to make sure that it's structured appropriately for that.
I also just wanted to relay a comment from the web. Someone commented and said that they want to make sure that everyone in the room is aware of the US's NTIA working group on IoT security. They have a catalog of existing IoT security standards and a technical capabilities and patching expectations working group. So it might be useful to take a look at that and see if there are ways that we can work together, things that we overlap on.
Yes, I strongly agree. The NTIA has done a lot of work on this. The U.S. National Telecommunications and Information Administration has a working group about this. There's another set of people working on this at the U.S. National Institutes for Standards and Technology. So there's a lot of resources out there just in the United States, but we've got also international ones and so on. Do we still have these things circulating? I'm alert to the time.
Yeah.
So they haven't made it to the back. That's good to know. They're still moving. I told you I was going to bar the doors, so you know this is what I'm doing.
Will there be some kind of coordinative function at ISOC that's going to kind of sort us out a little bit, nudge us along, keep us happy, make sure we work? Where'd he go?
I believe he's standing. I believe he's standing right next to you.
I'll be your guy. So.
So Tom is the Sherpa for this. That's right. Network resiliency.
Where's decision support? Where's that one? It's here. Oh, it's over there. Great. Great.
Yeah? All right. Wait, no. No, you?
Do you have more housekeeping that you want to? I guess what I'm really asking is, can I sit down?
Yes.
All right.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. This was great discussion today, and I think we've got a real solid plan forward right now. I hope you'll be able to join us at a reception that starts very shortly at Side Door, which is out to the left, I'm told, and just a little ways down. Yeah, thank you very much. It's an inspiring day, I think, and I look forward to the discussions on whatever tool we decide to use for each of the working groups. Tom is the guy who will be providing all of the support to the groups and making sure that everything gets done and everything happens. So, yeah, and that's about it. Thank you very much.